Chapter 299. Long time no see, great-grandfather. After Ai Qing went to London to study, she had not seen her great-grandfather for 7 years. However, after 7 years, her words were not as warm and affectionate as others expected. Instead, they were as cold and indifferent as hatred. Yin Liangji calmly listened to her words and looked around indifferently. Finally, his gaze fell on her table. It was a card embedded in a crystal frame. Even with his back to the frame, he could still imagine what kind of scene it was. "This should be the masterpiece you are most proud of, right?" He nodded and expressed his approval. "Your eyes are much better than mine. After leaving home for so many years, little Qing, you have indeed achieved something." Ai Qing lowered her head and looked at the face brimming with light. She couldn't help but laugh. "What's going on? Great-grandfather, are you regretting it?" "Ah yes." The old man nodded seriously. "If I had expected him to have such achievements, I would have been the one to raise this child. Unfortunately, after I met his parents, I was completely disappointed in his family. This was my biggest oversight. I should have thought twice before I acted. If I had to say, I shouldn't have cared so much about face in the past and directly cut the weeds and get rid of the root. Unfortunately, I am not as smart as you and only now understand this principle." He sighed softly. "Unfortunately, there is no more chance now." Ai Qing coldly twirled her pen, admiring the old man's undisguised frustration and annoyance. It was as if she was looking at the tears of a crocodile. From the time he became third place in the rookie competition, before he stepped into the rookie competition, when he became an ascender, you should have expected this day. By the time Qi Wen's death alerted you, it was already too late. He is already an official member of the Astronomy Association, a newcomer favored by the 4 major armies, and a latecomer that both the Governing Bureau and the Continuation Academy have already made arrangements for. Even after he leaves the Astronomy Association, the Eastern Summer Genealogy will unhesitatingly support him. After he advances from the Ivory Tower, one day, he will climb up the ladder of the Astronomy Association and become an indispensable pillar of the celestial genealogy. He will become the shadow that forever hangs over the Yin family. You know what, Xiao Qing? I really miss the way you and him worked so well together." Yin Liangji seemed to be absent-minded. Like countless old people, he reminisced about the past. "When Huai Guang was still alive, we used to work together like all of you. Huai Guang and Yin were never separated. He was the one who carried out the plan, and I was the one who made the plans. Both of us worked together, and we never failed. Unfortunately, Huai Guang died early. He died too early. If he hadn't died, all of this wouldn't have happened, right? There's no need to wait for your generation. The Yin family's resurgence will be complete in my hands, and that idiot Huai Guang will definitely be able to realize his dream and become one of the most famous explorers of hell. His name will be imprinted on the myriad worlds tablet. The so-called life is such a fragile thing. Everything in this world is more fragile than life." Yin Liangji raised his fingers that were covered in age spots and tapped his walking stick. "Good things in the world are not firm, and colorful clouds scatter easily. This world changes too easily. It's too easy. In just a few years, everything in the past can be wiped away. In the end, he'll become an interlude and I'll be successful." Ai Qing was indifferent. She didn't say anything, but Yin Liangji raised his eyes. His turbid eyes were filled with solemnity and indifference. He was clearly an old man who was so stooped that he had to worry about falling while walking, but now he seemed to be looking down at Ai Qing. He was looking at his insensible great-granddaughter. "You're mocking my hypocrisy, aren't you, little Qing?" Yin Liangji said. "You're always obsessed with appearances, but you can't look at the big picture. I know what you want to say. It's nothing more than the unimportant moral condemnation that I've embezzled the Huai family's assets. To be honest, this should be the best decision I've made since Huai Guang's death. At the end of the day, Isn't what I'm doing a normal business competition? Even if it's a competition that's dozens of times dirtier than this, there's still competition in the world, right? What do you think I should do? When a fatal oversight suddenly appears between two parties that were originally closely tied together, should I give up on my ambitious goal and let everyone sink together, or should I sacrifice one person's last legacy to give the other a chance to succeed? Just because he used to be my friend, I can't buy over his business? Just because we were once friends, I don't deserve to succeed? If I let others do it, they'll only be colder and crueler than me. Compared to such a huge amount of assets, any kind of elegance and etiquette are insignificant. They'll only be more vicious and ugly. They won't even spare Huaishi's life. That's right, I watched his parents reap the consequences of their own actions. In the end, they suffered the consequences of their own actions. But you have to be clear about one thing, little Qing. Whose pity is it that allowed him to live until now? Ai Qing couldn't help but sneer. You can try to reason with him, if you think he'll spare your life when the time comes. I will, even if he won't listen, the old man said calmly. For the family, comparing an old man who is nearing the end of his days and a new talent with a bright future, is there a need to talk about who is more important? I can kneel in front of him and beg for his forgiveness. I can put down my dignity and backbone, flatter him like a dog, endure the humiliation, and dry my face. If he's still angry, I can stretch my neck and let him chop me. It doesn't matter even if my bones are turned into ashes. But what can I do? Looking at Ai Qing's stiff expression for a moment, he shook his head in disappointment. It's just one person who died. Is there a need to make a fuss about nothing? Little Qing, in addition to age, have you really grown a little bit over the years? If your perspective can't be raised and you can't overlook the whole situation, no matter how smart you are, it's just quick-wittedness. It can't be called wisdom. And you're too smart, so smart that you're too smart. You've always made the most appropriate choice, but sometimes the most appropriate choice is often not the best. For example, you've already lost your best opportunity for revenge. Looking at little Qing's gloomy expression, the old man smiled regretfully. Even without me, the current Yin family wouldn't be able to recover from this setback, right? Didn't you see it too? That child Inya, although he doesn't have your vision and wisdom, as the head of the family, he's naturally magnanimous. Now that the Yin family has broken away from the bloody accumulation of capital, a benevolent and broad-minded young man is a more suitable candidate for the head of the family than an annoying old man like me. In other words, from the moment he advanced, the carefree revenge you're looking forward to is already meaningless. Because from that moment on, my life and death has become an insignificant matter. The old man told her sincerely, this is the meaning of the family. Little Qing, each of us is an insignificant speck of dust, but when the specks of dust gather together, they can make a difference and have meaning. We use our blood as a bond, trust and authority, and hope to make up for our shortcomings and step onto a higher peak. For this goal, all the members can be sacrificed, he said, including your parents, including me. Crack! A furious shattering sound burst out from Ai Qing's hand. The fountain pen broke, and the ink flowed out from her fingertips with a trace of dark red. The words from her great-grandfather carried a mocking tone that bordered on humiliation. It was a test. No, it should be said that it was an interrogation that left no room for negotiation. If the person standing in your way of revenge wasn't me, but the only brother who had ever taken care of you, Inya, what choice would you make? If one day Inya became Huaishi's enemy, how would you humiliatingly comply with the enemy's wishes and convince your revenge tool to only kill the evil leader? At that time, would this old thing do as he had said, stretch out his neck for the kill? No, there would only be more arrangements and more conspiracies waiting for her, right? You see, I've already told you. The old man looked at her helplessly. This world changes too easily. Your relationship is something that can be broken so easily, just like the friendship between Huai Guang and I. Because at the end of the day we are all the same. There has never been any difference between us. I used to value you so much that I even wanted you to replace Yin Ye and continue this family. Otherwise, why would I send you to London to study? But even so, it shouldn't be a reason for you to act recklessly. The rebellious period should be over, Shao Qing. In the dead silence, he said kindly to Ai Qing, "You should do your duty." Ai Qing didn't say anything, just looked at him coldly. Only the sound of hurried footsteps came from outside the door. "What's going on?" Chai Fei pushed the door and entered, asking in shock, "Why did Minister Ji suddenly suspend you?" Sorry to disturb you." Looking at the indifferent grandfather and granddaughter in the office, she came back to her senses. She placed the notice on Ai Qing's desk and hurriedly ran away. Before she left, she glanced at Ai Qing through the crack of the door, waiting for an answer anxiously. But Ai Qing didn't look at her, as if she didn't notice her arrival at all. She just stared at her great-grandfather in silence, expressionless. She sighed and closed the door. "It's really your style, great-grandfather. Even the daughter of a sacrifice can be used as a chess piece?" In the silence, Ai Qing loosened her fingers and threw the broken pen into the basket. She took out a tissue and wiped the ink on her hand. She suddenly asked, "Do you really have to think about the consequences?" "Don't worry." Yin Liangji didn't answer the question. "Since I let you go home, I won't let you have any worries. You can't wait to put me to use. After all, the day after tomorrow is my 100th birthday. I have to celebrate it." Yin Liangji calmly replied, "Don't worry, I've already seen him. He's a horse from the Chui family in Bingzhou. Although he was born blind, he didn't wrong you. A blind man and a cripple. It sounds like a good match. Who says it isn't?" The old man quietly stared at the gradually dimming sunlight outside the window. At dusk, the crisp sound of bells echoed in the sky of the distant school, and the noise gradually rose from the road. The children should go home. Chapter 300. After sitting in the chair for less than half an hour, Huai Shi got drunk and fell on the table with a bang. He fell into a deep sleep. Then, he had a dream. In the dream, there was the distant and melodious sound of a cello. It was as if he had returned to his childhood, playing with other children in the courtyard, chasing and playing. When he turned around, he saw the teacher leaning against the door, smiling and waving at them. She took out a handkerchief and wiped the snot and stains on Huai Shi's face. The afternoon sun shone on the teacher's long hair, plating it with a layer of fleeting golden glow, making her smile gentle and blurry. Huai Shi couldn't see her face clearly. His attention was all on the girl sitting alone behind the teacher. His cheeks turned red as he stared blankly at the girl sitting alone in the piano room behind the teacher. The teacher bent down, reached out and pinched his face. Then, he asked something. So he raised his head, puffed out his chest, and answered loudly, I want to be friends with Sister Shao Qing." The teacher laughed. Holding his hand, they walked toward the lonely girl. The sound of the cello stopped abruptly, and the memory fragments were suddenly cut off. Huai Shi opened his eyes, got up from the table again, and stared blankly at everything in front of him. The dream just now quickly dissipated in his memory. He couldn't remember the details, but he felt a sense of absurdity. It was like a fairy tale. The warm color was so extravagant in his childhood memory that it was almost unreal. Was it the excessive beautification of his subconscious or pure imagination? He wasn't sure. After a long time, he woke up slightly from the drunken stupor and confusion. He turned around and looked at Yu Dongri beside him, and finally his gaze fell on the wine glass in front of him. His eyes were filled with suspicion. What wine is this? He only drank a few mouthfuls and he was already drunk? Oh, you woke up so quickly. Yu Dongri clicked his tongue in wonder. The special water of life produced by the Russian Federation's genealogy. It is said that even a stone will get drunk after drinking it. You just lay there for a while? Huaisher picked up the glass and sniffed it. Finally, he smelled the alcohol that was about to turn into poison under the cover of the bartender. His expression immediately twitched. After pouring away the glass of wine in disgust, he waved his hand and ordered a glass of juice before continuing to daydream. By the way, where were we? Oh yes, Shambhala. Yu Dongri continued with a cigarette in his mouth. Shambhala is a great place. Not only is the climate suitable, the scenery is beautiful, and the beauty technology is top-notch. They have the best hot springs and spa in the world. For 3 years in a row, they have been voted the most suitable border for recuperation. Huaisher pressed on his throbbing forehead and could not hear anything clearly. He could only feel that the words went into his left ear and out his right ear. He really could not figure out what kind of place Shambhala was, but he did not want old Lu to explain it all by himself. Which country? Public sovereignty borders. Most of the borders nowadays are like this. They are developed and managed by a few local families or groups, forming a committee. Hey, I digress. Although it is not a gourmet city, there are still more than a dozen restaurants that are rated by the mouth of hunger, and the wine is also good. The last time I stayed there for a few days, I even grew a few more strands of hair. Speaking of this, old Lu's eyebrows twitched. He even parted his hair to show his hairline that was struggling to fight against fate. Huaisher's expression twitched and he smiled awkwardly. It sounds great. And there are also beautiful girls. You know girls, right? Old Lu took out his collection of photos and showed them to him. There are all kinds of girls. Passionate and unrestrained American girls, determined and strong Russian Federation girls, cute Ingzhou girls, and even a lot of Egyptian noblewomen. It had to be said that although old Lu was a little unrestrained, his photography skills were still pretty good. Huaisher's eyes widened as she sucked in a breath of cold air. Wow, so good. You think that's it? Yu Dongri smiled mysteriously, picked up a tourism brochure from the side, and flipped through it quickly. A chain store set up by 16 workshops and Metatron Cube's offline store. There are all kinds of weapons. Most importantly, there is an exhibition of Cavendish's giant war robots. As he spoke, he turned directly to the last page and showed Huaisher a huge promotional poster that spanned across the page. It was a giant humanoid robot with a sword in its hand, and its eyes were shining with golden light. Oh! Huaisher's face was red with excitement, and his eyes were wide open. Old Lu still felt that it was not enough, and he raised his voice. In addition to 6 new types of jetpacks and weapons, the most important thing is that a lucky tourist will be selected to provide driving services. What the hell is this place? Is it heaven? Huaisher felt that his nose was about to bleed, and he wanted to jump into the poster. How is it? Yu Dongri closed the brochure and smiled mysteriously. I happen to have a customized ticket for a high-end tour here. Do you want to go together? Forget it. Huaisher sighed. Why? Yu Dongri's eyes widened. Are you crazy? There are giant robots, and you can drive them. Are you still a man? There are hot springs, young ladies, and giant robots, but what does that have to do with me? I just want to go back to Xian High, go home, and sleep. Huaisher lowered his head to look at his phone, and he scrolled through the messages on the screen. I only took 2 days off, and it's already past the time. No matter what, I have to go back and ask AI Ching for a few more days, right? Yu Dongri did not say anything. By the way, why can't I contact AI Ching? Huaisher raised his head and stared at Yu Dongri's face. Do you have any clues? I've only been here for 2 days. How would I know? Maybe it's a closed-door training. This kind of thing happens often. Yu Dongri laughed. I'll help you ask for leave later. The plane will take off in an hour. Why don't we go first? No, I'm not going. Huaisher said calmly. You're hiding something from me. It's about AI Ching, right? Huaisher asked. Yu Dongri pretended not to hear him. He turned back to admire the young ladies in the bar, and he whistled nonchalantly. Then I'll ask Ol Shao directly. Huaishe pretended to make the call, but he was stopped by Yu Dongri in a hurry, and his expression was bitter. I say, why do you have to get involved in this mess? Huaishe was expressionless. You have to tell me what happened, right? How would I know? Yu Dongri's face was filled with grief and indignation. When he saw Huaishe's indifferent expression, he became even more indignant. I'm not lying to you. I really don't know. 2 days ago, Sister Ai came to me and told me that the Yin family will most likely make a move on you. She told me to tell you to be patient. Now is not the time. She told me to take you abroad for a few days and come back after the storm passes. Her intuition is like a crow's beak. The more serious the situation, the more accurate it is. I don't dare to not believe her. Huaishe was stunned for a long time. Then, he heard the door in the distance being pushed open. An unfamiliar woman quickly walked in and looked around. When she saw Huaishe's table, she hurriedly rushed over and sat down while panting. She picked up the vodka that had just been served on the table and drank it in one gulp. Oh no, Ai Qing is in trouble. Huaishe was stunned. Excuse me, who are you? She's still your colleague. Ai Qing didn't mention her to you. Forget it, she doesn't look like someone who would introduce her friends to others. Chai Fei sighed helplessly. She glanced at Yu Dongri, then looked at Huaishe. An hour ago, she was suspended for investigation. She helped you cover up the Red Gloves incident. Later, when Green Day was implicated in the Jinling incident, the investigation team decided to suspend her duties for investigation. As a result, she was immediately taken away by the Yin family. Yu Dongri's expression twitched. He raised his hand and slapped his face, silently cursing. How did you find me here? He asked. Don't underestimate your best friend's intuition, okay? Chai Fei glanced at him. Just look at her call history, then compare it with the people she has contacted in the past 2 days. Finally, look at the location of Huaishe's phone, and you can confirm it, okay? After seeing the travel brochure and plane ticket next to Yu Dongri, she was stunned for a moment. Then, she suddenly realized, wow, are you guys planning to run away? Isn't that too embarrassing? Yu Dongri had a bitter expression. Can I say that I'm innocent? Forget it, it doesn't matter if you guys stay or leave. Chai Fei pouted. She waved her hand and asked the waiter to serve the snack brand. Then, she began to eat high-calorie food. Her mouth was full, and she said vaguely, anyway, as a friend, all I can do is to inform you guys. No, the main point is actually Huaishe over there. I can't do anything else. You're too shallow as a friend. The friends in the office are already very loyal to each other. Chai Fei glared at Yu Dongri. Also, aren't you a gigolo? You cheated so many innocent girls of their money, and you still have the right to criticize me. Yu Dongri, who was at the bottom of the chain of contempt, was speechless. If you ask me, Shao Qing isn't the type to sit and wait for death. Also, the suspension document this time is too strange. Something might happen later. It's better for you guys to stay away. Chai Fei patted Huaishe's shoulder. If she didn't say anything to you, then it's best if you don't get involved. Wait, your surname is Huai? Huaishe nodded. Forget it, I'm afraid I came here for nothing. Chai Fei rubbed her forehead with a headache. That woman is crazy. I'm afraid the Yin family will really come for you this time. It's best if you go out and hide for a while. After a while, they won't be able to do anything to you. You're saying the Yin family wants to make an example of Huaishe? Yu Dongri was in disbelief. Why not? If we let him develop, then one day he will destroy our entire family? Chai Fei sneered. Even if there's pressure from the Social Security Bureau, there are still many ways. Don't you know how many ways there are to destroy a person? They don't have to do anything. They just have to let Huaishe seek his own death. For example, if you overestimate yourself and provoke the Yin family can't be blamed for fighting back, right? She threw the entire chicken wing into her mouth and swallowed it, including the skin and bones. Finally, she spat out the insignificant dregs into the trash can. So, this is her arrangement? Huaishir lowered his head and looked at the plane ticket next to Yu Dongri. He suddenly understood. Chai Fei nodded. There's something I haven't said before. Huaishir was silent for a long time and sighed softly. I really hate the way she acts as if everything is under her control. He picked up the glass and drank the juice and ice cubes inside. He chewed the hard ice cubes and swallowed them. The glass was gently placed on the coaster. The smooth rim of the glass reflected Huaishir's eyes. He said, I won't. Tsk. Yu Dongri tilted his head and sighed. To be honest, I've had enough of her self-righteous arrangements and plans, even if I don't have the chance to tell her. Huaishir looked up and whispered to himself, Who does she think she is? She has a cold face and doesn't even know how to smile at people. She only cares about making arrangements for others and thinks that it's good for others. There's something wrong with this woman from the beginning, right? Yu Dongri opened his mouth, but he didn't know what to say. So, I'm not leaving. Huaishir looked up at them. I'm going to stay, and I'm going to look for her and walk right into her trap. Are you crazy? Yu Dongri scratched his wig in annoyance and looked at him as if he was looking at a fool. Are you crazy because you're a prince? Do you think you can handle everything? In fact, I haven't handled anything. Huaishir replied calmly. Many times I think I can handle it, but in the end, there are others who help me. When I do things impulsively, it often makes things worse. I thought I could save Luo Xian, but Luo Xian is still lying in the hospital. How can I have the face to think that I can save Ai Qing? Then what are you after? Do you want to die? No, I just thought of it now. The young man sighed softly and couldn't help but laugh. I originally wanted to be good friends with her. Yu Dongri was stunned. From the first time I saw her, I told the teacher that I wanted to be friends with her. Huaishir lowered his head and couldn't help but laugh. Now that I think about it, she was exactly the same as she is now. She was prouder than anyone else, and she was also better than anyone else. She even played the piano better than us. She was always alone and never played games with others. Later, after we became familiar with each other, her attitude would occasionally become closer. She was like a wild cat, and people couldn't do anything about it. But she has always taken care of me. Even after knowing that there was a problem with me, she was still willing to be with me. Although there are many things that are not satisfactory, I still admire and like Ai Qing very much. She is still willing to be my friend, so I can't leave, and I can't just leave her here alone. Huaishir said seriously, I will go find her, even if she doesn't want to. Yu Dongri asked expressionlessly, What if someone stops you? Then I'll deal with it as I see fit. Huaishir shrugged. If possible, it would be best if I could kill her great-grandfather while I'm at it. Yu Dongri asked, What if you don't come back? Then I won't go. Huaishir shrugged. I'll go home and sleep. There's everything in my dreams. Can't you just hope that I'll be better? I'm just reminding you not to avoid the objective reality, Yu Dongri said coldly. You have to think clearly. This time, no one will help you. Please don't say such things to a 17-year-old Chunibyu. Huaishir couldn't help but laugh. There are some things that must be done, right? Then I wish you a safe journey to the netherworld. Yu Dongri helplessly picked up the wine glass and drank the wine in the glass. He took out money and a tip and put it under the glass. I should go. Be careful. He turned and left. Chai Fei, who was next to him, looked at the two of them, and her eyes sparkled with excitement. Angry for a beauty. Young man, you have a bright future. Huaishir's eyes lit up. Then are you willing to help? I won't. Chai Fei shook her head and smiled slyly. If you want to be a hero, please do it yourself. Why make things difficult for a weak office clerk like me? By the way, can I order another fruit platter? No, thank you. I don't have the money to pay the bill. Huaishir shook his head and sighed. To be honest, I regretted it as soon as I said it. Can you help me call him back? I still want to see the super-large robot. Chai Fei shrugged with a helpless look on her face. Come on, little brother. She clenched her hands and cheered Huaishe on. I have faith in you. Huaishe curled his lips, picked up his backpack, and got up to leave. You're on your way? Chai Fei was surprised. Go home, sober up, and sleep, Huaishe said grumpily and pushed the door open. The door closed, leaving Chai Fei sitting alone in the same place. She looked down at the messages on her phone. After a long time, her smile became more and more happy and proud. Oh, I really deserve to be called a golden best friend. Waiter, give me another fried chicken. It was a pity that without the cold eyes of her best friend to accompany her meal, she always felt that something was missing. I really hope nothing will happen. She sighed softly. Chapter 301. The next day, late at night. There were barely any people on the quiet streets. There were only the flickering lights of cigarettes in the alleys and the flashing lights of the vending machine. After Huaishe went back to the hotel yesterday, he slept for the entire night and most of the day. Then, he used the room service to order a 10-person bucket and stayed in the hotel to watch 2 movies and half of a new show. After 6:00 in the evening, he went online to search for discount coupons for the latest FPS games. On a forum, he was arguing with someone about the balance of a mobile game. Just now, he asked Anjihu if he needed to wear a suit to a formal event. By the time he wanted to buy one, he realized that it was already too late. Most of the stores in Jinling were closed. Now he was looking for the phone number of the nearest suit rental store. If you ask me, this little brother of yours is really amazing. He doesn't have the kind of sadness that you described at all. He is so depressed that he can't eat or sleep. His psychological quality is much better than a certain bald cowherd. When Yu Dongri heard the sarcastic words from the vending machine, his face twitched. He couldn't help but sigh. Can you stop insulting me? I think for a scumbag who still treats his ex-girlfriend as a tool after breaking up, these words are nothing but a breeze. What, does he know how to write the word shame? Yu Dongri's face became more and more helpless. He endured the sarcastic words from his ex-girlfriend through the vending machine. When the cold voice on the other end finally vented her anger, he asked, I know you have a problem with me, but no matter what, I'm still your customer, right? Oh, so you don't want me to use my internal authority to help you get a discount? No, sister, I'm sorry. Yu Dongri's spine was bent by money. Just treat me as a scumbag and scold me a few more times. If you're happy, then you have the motivation to work. If you're not happy, then I'll scold him for you. That Lu guy is really a piece of shit. It's good that you know. The vending machine shook and a can of drink fell out. This is what you want. It's about what happened to the Yin family. After opening the can, a thick roll of paper slid out. As expected of tomorrow's news. Yu Dongri sighed. It's just that it's not very convenient to use this method all the time. Can't we find a place to talk face to face? The vending machine sneered. Forget it, I'm afraid I won't be able to resist the urge to cut your face a few times. In the silence, Yu Dongri sighed and looked down at the information on the paper. His face became more and more unsightly. Really? What do you think? The voice from the vending machine said coldly. If you want to talk about ugliness, I don't know how many things that happen in this kind of destitute family are dozens of times uglier than this. In order to maintain power, this is just a common occurrence, and there's no need to hide it at all. Anyway, only a meddlesome person like you would dig this kind of thing out from a pile of old books. It's so pitiful to be involved in something like this. That little girl, Yu Dongri smoked and sighed softly. As he flipped through the records in his hands, he could almost imagine what had happened to the Yin clan 20 years ago, the changes that had completely pushed Ai Qing into the abyss she was in today. At that time, the Yin clan had already entered a period of rapid growth after taking control of many border crossings. Unfortunately, they had very few people. Compared to the large number of people in the clan, there were very few people who had the talent to ascend. Apart from those who had been recruited from outside, there was only one person who had ascended in that generation. No matter how much effort and preparation they had put in, ascension was still something that normal people could only hope for. Take Ai Qing's father, for example. He had been born with an abundance of origin substance, and had the highest possibility of ascension among his peers. However, he had still been at the edge of that bottleneck for more than 10 years. After exhausting all of his hope, he had quietly retreated and was excluded from the core of the clan. A few years later, he married a famous cellist, and the couple's relationship was harmonious. After losing the qualifications to become an ascender, he instead found his own happiness in the world of ordinary people, and after getting married, he gave birth to a concubine. Not only had she inherited her father's abundance of origin substance, but she had also inherited her mother's outstanding talent in the cello. At that time, Yin Qing had lived a life far away from the Yin clan under her mother's insistence. In order to protect her daughter's life, as a mother, she didn't hesitate to go against the old man's wishes. In the end, she moved out of the Yin clan and went to Xinhai. All for the sake of letting her daughter live a normal life. As a mother, she had already done everything she could. Until one day, the Yin clan's only ascendant was seriously injured in a battle and didn't have long to live. Once he died, all of the Yin clan's shares in the border crossings would fall into the hands of outsiders who had been drooling over them for a long time. Without ascension, they didn't have the qualifications to enter the picture. Yu Dongri smoked his cigarette as he squinted at the records on the paper. So, a car accident happened? Yes, a car accident without any accidents or problems. The cold voice from the vending machine said, a family of 3 went to the zoo to celebrate their daughter's placing in the competition. On the way back, they collided with a truck that had malfunctioned. The scene was tragic, and the result was as you expected. When she woke up from the sudden dizziness and pain, she couldn't feel her lower body anymore. She started to cry and called for her mother subconsciously, but her mother didn't respond. Then she saw the pale face that had lost its breath. At the last moment before the collision, the woman who had jumped in front of her and blocked the impact for her. Bitter cries and death came suddenly, an out-and-out tragedy in the human world. In this sudden despair, the father who crawled out from the broken frame of the car hugged his wife, who had lost her life. He cried his heart out, tears of despair, and he called her name. No one responded. But when his world fell apart and his heart was almost broken, the miracle that he had been looking forward to for a long time suddenly came to him. He finally crossed the threshold that was once too high to reach and welcomed ascension. Therefore, Ai Qing, who was swallowed by fear, saw the man who hugged his wife's body and cried his heart out. His expression twitched, and then, an extremely ridiculous and extremely ugly smile of ecstasy appeared on his face. It was an ugly smile like that of a zombie. After watching the surveillance video of the vending machine, Yu Dongri fell into silence. After a long, long time, he lit the cigarette at the corner of his mouth and sighed hoarsely. From that day on, she began to hate ascenders, right? She hated her father, hated the family that murdered her mother. After losing everything, she instinctively began to hate everything. But what was even more disgusting was that, because of this, she discovered that she had the potential to ascend. If it weren't for this inner conflict and disgust, she would have already possessed a talent that surpassed her father. This world was like a cold joke to her. It was ridiculous and not worth mentioning. Yu Dongri shook his head in pity. I'm afraid it took all my strength to hold on until now. But what does this have to do with a bald cowherd like you? The vending machine asked indifferently. To what extent do you want to be involved before you give up? Or are you going to tell me that Huai Shi is your long-lost brother? Yu Dongri was stunned for a long time. He couldn't help but shake his head. Don't flatter him. He doesn't have as good looking as I do. After so many years, your narcissistic look is still disgusting. It's second only to when you want to hide something, such as now. The voice behind the vending machine became impatient. If I were you, I would go to Shambhala for surgery now. At least this way, you can live for a few more years, instead of inexplicably dying on the street one day and causing trouble to passers-by. Don't be like this, Yu Dongri hesitated. In the end, he sighed helplessly. I just want to be a good person. If you want to be a good person, why don't you die early and donate your inheritance to the Border Children's Medical Fund? It's definitely more touching than this, and after your death, you may be made into a movie about how an executioner of the Dark Force cares about the health of border children after retirement, instead of becoming a cowherd and wasting your precious life on a kindergarten ant career. The cold and harsh voice paused for a moment, and then the voice became vague. Yu Dongri, you don't have much time left. I know. It's meaningless to do so. I know. Yu Dongri smoked, shrugged his shoulders, and laughed. But I can't let that unlucky kid go alone, right? I know you care about me, thank you. But no matter what, I have to do something that I can. Yu Dongri took off the cigarette and stepped on it. I often feel that Huai Shi is very similar to me, but in fact, Huai Shi is much stronger than I was. If I had his tenacity and courage, I would definitely not choose to escape and fall to this level. Every time I see him working so hard to live, I can't help but feel ashamed and unable to face myself. But I think, if I can help him even a little, then my last period of retirement can be regarded as meaningful, right? The vending machine did not speak again. There was a sound of turning, and something heavy fell out of the machine. The huge box fell behind the lid of the retrieval port. Yu Dongri pulled out the box, which was half a body high, and put it on the ground. He skillfully opened the zipper, and saw the cold iron light sleeping between the sponge. He was stunned for a moment, and then he grinned. Thank you. Go and waste your life, idiot. The vending machine said coldly, I wish you an early death in your sweet dreams, better than staying in this world and being tortured. The light of the vending machine was cut off, and no sound came from it. After a long silence, Yu Dongri smiled, pulled up the zipper with a smile, pulled up the strap, carried the slender box on his shoulder, and staggered into the darkness at the end of the road. Only a faint singing voice could be heard. Oh, children lost in the night. The hoarse humming voice gradually faded away. Oh, children lost in the night, wait for the light of day. The night was long. Chapter 302. The next day, in the morning, dark clouds covered the sky. On the purple-silver mountain outside of Jinling, there was a winding mountain road that led all the way to the huge villa at the top of the mountain. It looks like it's going to rain? In the back seat of the car, a girl stuck her head out and looked at the sky through the window. I think I see it. The Yin family is even higher up. Don't they find it troublesome? There's not even a supermarket in the wilderness. Wouldn't they have to drive for an hour just to buy a pack of tissues? Why would the Yin family need to go down the mountain to buy tissues? The brother next to her laughed. Xiaoying, remember not to joke around when you get to the Yin family. I'm just telling you to relax a little. Cui Ying pouted. Second brother, what if the person you're going on a blind date with is a bad woman? I heard that woman is notorious in the astronomy club. Won't your family be disturbed? It's all the elder's idea. Otherwise, she wouldn't be interested in a blind person like me. Cui Ning smiled indifferently. At most, we'll go our separate ways. Look, your third brother and his wife have a good relationship after marriage, right? That's an exception. Third brother has a good temper, but he still has to move out every now and then. Cui Ying sighed. Uncle said that I should get married in a few years. You're still young. What are you thinking about? Cui Ning raised her hand and flicked her little sister's forehead. Don't worry, I've already talked to Uncle. You can choose someone you like. As long as you don't get abducted by any random man outside once you're in love, it'll be fine. Second brother is the best. Chui Ying cheered. She hugged her brother's arm and shook it vigorously. She only stopped when Chui Ning couldn't take it anymore and pushed her away. After staying in the strict house for a long time, she was like a sparrow released from the wind when she came out. She looked at the scenery outside the window and pointed. In the end, she was stunned. There's someone in front. In front of the mountain road, beside the road, there was a figure in gray clothes slowly going up. He was holding an empty mineral water bottle in his hand. He looked lost and helpless. Who is it? Chui Ping couldn't see and asked the driver. A young man, about 18 or 19 years old. He didn't take a car and walked up alone. The driver glanced at him and said, "He's an ascender. He should be going to the Yin family to celebrate the old master's birthday like us, right?" Second stage. Chui Ping sensed for a moment and seemed to be a little startled. But soon, his furrowed brows relaxed slightly. It's quite a gentle aura. It's not hostile to us. She looks pretty good too. Wait, stop the car. Chui Ying leaned against the car window and looked at the young man's side profile. She was stunned for a moment and quickly shouted at the driver. "What's wrong?" Chui Ping was puzzled. Why sure. Second brother. That's why sure. Chui Ying turned her head, and her face was red with excitement. She spoke incoherently. "It's the Prince of Paradise. The super handsome one. I even borrowed money from you to buy his card." Chui Ping's expression twitched as he felt helpless. "Uncle Lu, stop the car," he said. "Since we've met, I'll give you a ride. Who knows, I might even be able to get an autograph for my sister." Chui Ying cheered. Then, on the mountain road, Huai Shi, who was looking at the navigation on his phone blankly, saw the car in front of him stop by the side of the road. The car window was rolled down and an unfamiliar girl waved at him. "Are you Mr. Huai? If you're going to the Yin family, we'll give you a ride." "That's great." Huai Shi was stunned, and then he was pleasantly surprised. He sped up and chased after her, and saw the door of the front passenger seat slowly open. Thank you. He sat in the car and thanked the driver and the two people in the back seat. "I didn't expect the navigation to show a straight line. I didn't want to take a taxi because I was greedy. Sorry for the trouble." "It's okay. We help each other when we're outside." Chui Ping nodded politely, but Chui Ying excitedly stuck her head out from behind. Her cheeks were red, and the way she looked at him made Huai Shi a little scared. "Mr. Huai Shi, would it be convenient for you to give me an autograph?" "Huh!" Huai Shi was stunned. When he saw the card and pen that she handed over, he immediately understood. He smiled bitterly and nodded. "Okay, but to be honest, please don't expect too much from me. I'm not like how I was in the live broadcast." However, Chui Ying's eyes were still blinking, full of expectation. Huai Shi sighed and took the pen and card. "May I ask what your name is?" "Chui Ying. There's a jade under the grass character headscarf." "Okay." Huai Shi put the card on his lap, and then tried his best to write in his most authentic handwriting, "Thank you, Miss Chui Ying, for giving me a ride, Huai Shi." Chui Ying couldn't wait to take back the card, and then she laughed strangely. Then, she quickly took out her phone and took several photos of Huai Shi and herself, and sent them to who knows where. "Please don't take offense." Chui Ping coughed awkwardly. "My little sister has been at home for a long time and hasn't gone out much. It's okay. To be honest, I'm quite happy to see that I'm so popular." Huai Shi smiled shyly and asked casually, "May I ask if the two of you are going to the Yin residence for a birthday celebration?" "Yes, we're going on a blind date." Chui Ying pouted helplessly and pointed at her brother. "It's for my brother." Huai Shi was stunned and then looked at him with pity. "I have a feeling that your blind date will be very scary, friend. You have to be careful." Chui Ping didn't know how to respond. Fortunately, it didn't take long for them to arrive at the villa in front. It was decorated with lanterns and streamers, and the atmosphere was jubilant. They could vaguely see that the parking lot in front of the villa was already full of cars, and there was even more traffic in front of the villa, with people coming and going. What a big house! Huaisher leaned forward and tilted his head to look at the huge archway in the distance and couldn't help but exclaim, "Isn't this much bigger than my house?" He really looked like a country bumpkin. Cui Ping was about to say something, but he heard Huaisher's voice. "Okay, just put me down here. After all, I don't want to implicate you." Cui Ying looked up in confusion. "Aren't you here for a birthday celebration?" Huaisher opened the car door and smiled at Cui Ying. "No, I'm here for a debt." The car door closed. He stood in place and waved his hand as he watched the car gradually disappear into the distance. Then, he pressed the hilt of the sword of virtue beside his windbreaker, looked up, and walked towards the main entrance. After passing through the heavy traffic, he stood in front of the door. The butler waiting in front of the door bowed politely. "Sir, please show me your birthday banquet invitation." "Sorry, I don't seem to have that kind of thing." Huaisher shrugged and spread out his hands. The butler was stunned for a moment, but his expression didn't change. After all, he had worked in the Yin residence for so many years, and it was impossible for him to be ignorant. After a moment of hesitation, he said, "Can you tell me your name so that I can inform them?" "Why, sure," the youth replied. The old butler quickly recalled this name in his mind. Soon, he looked up and asked, "Is it Mr. Huai from the Astronomy Association?" "No." Huaisher shook his head and said calmly, "It's that Huaisher from Xian Hai's Huai family." The old butler's expression changed slightly. He didn't have time to lose his composure and turned to walk inside. Not long after, a figure hurriedly came out from behind the door. It was Yin Yen, who hadn't been seen in a long time. When he saw Huaisher, his expression became worse. After looking around, he pulled on Huaisher's clothes and pulled him to the side. He lowered his voice and asked, "You still dare to come here?" Huaisher looked at his confused expression and couldn't help but want to laugh. "Why do you look more anxious than me?" Yin Yen rolled his eyes and glared at him. "Do you know that it's easy for you to come today, but it's not so easy for you to leave now? Don't blame me for not reminding you. If I were you, I would turn around and leave right now. Don't make trouble for yourself, Huaisher." Huaisher shrugged. "What if I insist on making trouble?" Yin Yen didn't say anything and just stared at him. After a long time, he chuckled and nodded. "All right, I respect you as a man. I'll celebrate your death anniversary on this day next year." After saying this, he took a step back and pointed at the door, indicating for him to do as he pleased. Huaisher raised his hand and tidied up the windbreaker that he had messed up. He pointed at the suits that the guests were wearing. "Is it okay if I'm not wearing formal clothes? If you want to die, it doesn't matter even if you're naked." Yin Yen looked at him one last time, then turned and walked through the door. Under the curious and surprised gazes of all the guests, Huaisher shook his head and looked up at the cold door. He felt the premonition of death spread through his spine. He smiled slightly and stepped in. In the hall, Yin Yen finally found Inya, who was in charge. After he whispered the situation, Inya froze on the spot. After thinking for a moment, he said in a deep voice, "I'll take him down with me. I'll bring him down the mountain later. We can't disturb the old master's birthday banquet." At this time, the butler who rushed back from behind wiped the sweat on his forehead and reported in a low voice, "The old master said that since he's here, he should make arrangements. Otherwise, people will say that our Yin family doesn't know etiquette." Inya was silent for a moment and didn't say anything. He turned and left. Yin Yen stood in place and thought for a moment. He looked at his sisters who were walking in from the door and sneered. He was about to leave when he was stopped by one of the women. "Don't be in a hurry to leave, fourth brother," she asked. "I heard that the man that third sister likes is also here. Do you know where he is?" "In Xing, you call me fourth brother. I'll give you a piece of advice. Don't provoke him." Yin Yen lowered his head and whispered in his sister's ear, Don't enter the morning hall before the old master's birthday is over. Wouldn't that be bad? Fourth brother, are you joking? Xing sneered. If you want to lick little Nine, then lick it. Why do you have to scare me? Advice, fourth brother has already advised you. If you want to die, I can't stop you. Yen pointed in the direction of the side hall. He's over there. You better stay away. If you anger him, even your little wolf dog won't be able to protect you. When the man behind Xing heard him say this, his expression stiffened. He revealed an ugly expression, but he didn't say anything. Don't think about being in the limelight and surpassing her. Yen took one last look at his sister and shook his head regretfully. You can't compare to her. He turned and left, leaving Xing in place. Her expression gradually became ugly. Chapter 303. The Yin family was really rich. Just the few side halls for guests to rest and chat before the banquet started were already frighteningly large. They were not as flashy as gold and jade, but the details in every corner had obviously been carefully designed and considered, allowing people to fully relax without losing the solemn and quaint charm. The guests were obviously familiar with each other. They gathered together and chatted in twos and threes. The waiters in charge of service in the corner would occasionally bring in fruit and tea, then leave. They would only come forward to serve the guests when they wanted to. Although they couldn't provide alcohol for the time being, there were cigars, chess cards, snacks, and other recreational items available. While the adults were chatting, the children gathered at the edge of the hall and played games in front of the TV. Amidst the elegant and warm atmosphere, there was a discordant note. It was a young man sitting on a chair near the door, playing games with his legs crossed. Although Huai did not want to attract attention, it was a pity that other than his eye-catching long hair and appearance, he was the only one not wearing a formal suit. He was wearing a gray windbreaker over a t-shirt with a large robot drawn on it. He was even wearing a pair of dirty running shoes. There were several cracks on the upper of the running shoes, marks left behind in Yamatai. He did not remember to change when he came back. He even had a sword. Everyone's style was completely different. After he walked in and asked for the Wi-Fi password, he took out his phone and opened Silent Crown. He locked his god hands and started his happy journey to the top while his teammates were praising him. Full concentration, full concentration. There were even a few children who were attracted by his movement. They stood behind him and gave him advice. Go big. Go big. What's there to be afraid of? Don't go home, get more experience. Kill. Quick, snatch the kill. Hearing that they were so professional, Yi Qingxian naturally followed their advice. In a short 10 minutes, he had lost 3 times. His teammates slowly typed, and he floated away, hiding his achievements and fame. The children cheered and looked at him with admiration. They were also deeply puzzled. How did you become a holy disciple when you were so weak? TSK, what's with that look? Huai raised his eyebrows and started another round. Watch carefully. It's time to show my true strength. Then, they were matched with their previous teammate. Naturally, they were greeted with 4 question marks of despair. Young people nowadays can't take it anymore. Just a little setback, and they want to surrender. Huai shook his head helplessly and said to the children behind him, when you grow up, you can't learn from them. You have to be like your brother and be a useful person to society. Do you understand? This was the first time the children had seen such a shameless person. They didn't know whether they should agree or refute him. However, when Huai turned around, he saw a man walking towards him and standing in front of him. Huai, right? The man had a mocking and arrogant look on his face as he pointed upstairs. Miss Xing invites you upstairs for a chat. We're in the middle of a team battle. Can you be more observant? Huai glanced indifferently in the direction upstairs. He retracted his gaze and lowered his head to continue playing his game. I'm not going. The stranger frowned and his expression turned ugly. Seeing this, the children behind Huaishe all turned and ran away to look for their parent. This attracted a lot of surprised gazes. Friend, I'm already giving you a lot of face by letting you sit here. He bent down and patted Huaishe on the shoulder. He lowered his voice and said, Don't fail to appreciate my kindness. Do you know me? Huaishe asked without even raising his head. The stranger was stunned for a moment. Then, he heard the young man sigh. You definitely don't know me. At that moment, a crisp sound rang out from the phone. Huaishe's finger tapped on the screen. The hand of God, that had been slacking all this while suddenly appeared and rushed into the group battle, seizing the fleeting opportunity. Then, the level 10 skill from a new world was activated. Instantly, the screen was filled with dazzling flashes of light. In a short 3 seconds, the 4 people with low HP were all killed. Just as his teammates were in disbelief and question marks, Huaishe smiled evilly and turned off the game. He raised his head and scrutinized the stiff face that was seeping with traces of green. He shook his head in pity. If you knew me, you definitely wouldn't have patted my shoulder. The virus that sprouted from the mountain ghost's impure origin substance already blossomed and bore fruit on his body through that instant of contact. Crystallization spread through the fat, all the way until he turned into a statue within a wax shell. As his pupils trembled and spread, only intense and difficult breathing was left, mixed with the sound of his lungs. It was difficult to breathe. Huaishe stuffed the phone into his pocket and stood up. Under everyone's gaze, he reached into his pocket and grabbed the item in his inner pocket. He pulled it out and pointed the black cylinder at the terrified face of the newcomer. Yes, that's a marker. Huaishe uncapped the pen and wrote his name on the newcomer's forehead. In the end, he even thoughtfully drew an out-of-shape heart on the newcomer's face. Here, if you want an autograph, I've already given it to you. You can go up and report yourself later. Huaishe patted his shoulder and put away the virus. He reminded him earnestly, next time, remember to buy a handshake coupon. You can't have sightseeing meals and freeloading. You have to know your shame, okay? Ignoring the chill around the hall, Huaishe raised his hand and pointed his middle finger in the direction of the second floor. But unexpectedly, the premonition of death that was like a knife on his back disappeared in an instant. He heard a light cough beside him. It was a young man holding a cane. He was the kind-hearted person who had once taken Huaishe on a journey, Cui Ping. He smiled gently. Mr. Hui, is it convenient for us to talk? Huaishe thought for a moment and shook his head. To be honest, it's best if you don't know me. If you know why I'm here today, it doesn't matter if we don't know each other. I just don't want anything bad to happen. Cui Ping shrugged and waved at Huaishe, indicating for him to sit with him. This is my sister's request. It's the first time I've seen my sister worship someone other than us brothers so much. To be honest, I don't feel good about it. Huaishe subconsciously turned his head and saw Cui Ping sneaking glances at him from the group of girls. He couldn't help but smile bitterly and scratch his head. Girls always have unrealistic dreams when they're young. They'll be fine when they grow up. Although I'm worried about my sister, I can be sure of one thing. She's not the kind of shallow girl who mindlessly chases after celebrities because they look good. 2 days ago, she kept telling me about the new talent competition. Unfortunately, my eyes aren't good, so I didn't watch. I just remembered that you were the third-place finisher. It's just a fluke. Huaishe lightly replied. Hearing that he wanted to keep a distance, the second young master of the Cui family didn't get angry or unhappy. After a few simple words, he calmly smiled and fell silent. In all fairness, this was a very likable man. Although his eyes were disabled, he didn't feel any resentment or darkness. His temperament was gentle, his speech was elegant, and he made people feel like they were bathing in the spring breeze. Even when he was silent, he didn't make people feel awkward and relaxed. It's just that, the surrounding gazes really made people unhappy. Huaishe narrowed his eyes and stared at the reflection in the glass. the shadow lurking in the shadows of the hall spying on him. His finger tapped the hilt of the sword of virtue. Now it seems that the arrangement for me is already on the way. I just don't know how AI Ching is doing. After coming in for so long, I still haven't seen her. Could it be that she's under house arrest according to the tradition? In the ticking sound of the clock, Huaishur lowered his eyes and quietly waited for the birthday banquet to begin. As his index finger tapped on the hilt of the sword, time passed by minute by minute. Is he starting to make trouble? In the quiet reception room, after sending a guest away, an old man with a walking stick turned around and saw the shadow standing in the corner. After listening to his brief report, Yin Liangji nodded and couldn't help but sneer. Don't worry about him. He's still too young. He's too arrogant and can't keep his cool. If he really wants to leave, I can't do anything to him for the time being. Since he came here without knowing his own strength, it's not up to him to decide whether he lives or dies. Have you arranged everything? The shadow nodded. Very good. After pondering for a moment, a cold light flashed in the old man's turbid eyes. Watch him later. If he wants to make trouble, let him. The bigger the trouble, the better. When he's done, it's time to go. It doesn't matter if I lose face. No, it's better to make me lose face and be treated as a good-for-nothing old man. That way, I can complete the final handover more smoothly. Before I abdicate, I have to give up this worthless face and get rid of the last disaster for the younger generation. He narrowed his eyes and pondered for a long time. After confirming that there were no oversights, he nodded and rubbed his face in the mirror in the corner to make sure that he didn't show any signs of decline. He still looked radiant. After persevering for one last day, he could unload this heavy burden. Master, the birthday banquet has been arranged. The butler knocked on the door and asked respectfully, Can we start? Yin Liangji thought for a moment and asked, Did anything happen to Xiao Qing these few days? Third Miss has been staying in her room since she returned home. She didn't go out or contact the outside world. She didn't resist Master's orders and arrangements. The old butler replied, I think that maybe she finally understood Master's painstaking efforts and started to be obedient. It doesn't matter whether she's obedient or not. Yin Liangji shook his head indifferently. He didn't care whether AI Qing had learned her lesson or what she planned to do. These few days, her self-righteous secret arrangements had never left his sight. When the time came, he would prepare a big surprise for his great-granddaughter. In the end, she still doesn't understand people's hearts. He sighed regretfully and raised his eyes. He ordered, Start the banquet. Today is a big day for the family. Don't let the guests wait too long. The butler respectfully obeyed and turned to leave. 3 minutes later, the door of the banquet hall slowly opened. Under the guidance of the attendants, the guests began to enter. The old man who had changed his clothes looked energetic. He stood at the door and welcomed every guest who came. He smiled and thanked them. Soon, he saw the young man in front of him. Huaishur? The old man asked. The young man nodded and raised his eyes to look at the old man in front of him. He asked rudely, Yin Liangji, you're a guest. Please come in. The old man raised his hand and stopped the younger generation behind him who wanted to get angry. He just smiled kindly at Huaishur. Later, our two families will talk about friendship. Okay. Huaishur nodded and stepped into the banquet hall. He let the cold premonition of death engulf him. Next to him, the attendant's head was about to shrink into his neck. He just wanted to pretend that he didn't see or hear anything. He quickly led the way. But halfway there, he was stopped by someone. No need to lead the way. He's sitting next to me. The man named Enya waved his hand and dismissed the attendant. He pointed to the seat next to him and asked the young man, Is it convenient? It's close to the front row. I couldn't ask for more. Huaishur followed the advice and pulled out the chair. He sat steadily under the strange gaze of the brothers and sisters of the Yin family at the table. Yin Yen glanced at Huai Shi and pretended not to see it. He lowered his head and continued to play with the face cloth. Some people's eyes were cold, while others looked like they were ready to watch a monkey show. Their expressions were full of contempt and disdain. Huai Shi's affection didn't change. He picked up the red wine that the waiter poured for him. After taking a sip, he asked in his usual country bumpkin tone, "Can you give me some happy water?" The waiter was stunned. After seeing Enya waving his hand, he hurriedly took a few steps back and stood in the corner. "Do you smoke?" Enya asked. "I'm still underage," Huai Shi answered seriously. Then he took the cigarette from his hand. "It's time to smoke more." Enya was stunned. He couldn't help but smile and handed his lighter over. On the stage, a star that was often seen on TV was already singing. In the jubilant singing, all the hostility in the dark seemed to have melted away and became peaceful. "I'm Little Qing's brother." Enya raised his head and looked at the performance on the stage. He suddenly said, "If you're willing to believe me, please sit here and finish this meal. I won't let anything happen to her." At the table, the other people's expressions changed. They wanted to say something, but after he swept his gaze over them, no one dared to be impudent in front of their big brother. "I believe you." "Why wouldn't I believe you?" Huai Shi looked at their miserable appearances and couldn't help but want to laugh. "Seeing your prestige, I believe you. But, is it really that simple?" Enya didn't say anything. "Isn't it because you're only her brother that you're powerless in many things?" the youth asked indifferently. "Otherwise, it wouldn't be to this extent, right?" Huai Shi didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he told him bluntly, "I want to take away AI Qing. I want it today." Amidst the gentle singing, Enya was silent for a long time. He sighed softly. The suppressive hostility of a fourth stage ascendant fell on him without any concealment. "If that's the case, then I'm your enemy, Huai Shi." "I know." Huai Shi calmly nodded. Enya glanced at him one last time and warned, "If you act recklessly, you'll die here today." "I know that too," Huai Shi replied with a smile. "Moreover, I'm probably already used to that kind of thing." The sword of virtue leaning on the table trembled slightly. A clear and melodious cry burst forth from the cacophony. The cracks on the scabbard spread, because the sharp object was ready to strike. The song curled up and dissipated in a long lingering rhythm. The guests raised their hands and offered their applause. Soon the applause also stopped. Everyone's gaze fell on the front, on the old man who slowly stood up from his chair. "First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming to celebrate this rotten old man's birthday." The smiling old man waved at the guests. In the jubilant atmosphere, his eyes seemed to inadvertently sweep over Huai Shi. His smile was still kind. "Here, I have another happy matter to announce. But before that, I'd like to introduce everyone to my favorite great-grandson, AI Qing." In the applause, the old man turned his head and looked at the door behind him. As the door opened, the girl in the wheelchair, pushed by the servant, came in front of everyone. Huai Shi raised his eyes, slightly startled. She didn't look as sad and emaciated as he imagined. Her expression was as calm as ever, and she even looked a little chubbier. Her face had a rosy luster. When she raised her face, she gave a polite smile to the guests. Even though it was just a smile, it made people unable to move their eyes away. There was a kind of sickly beauty that made people feel tender affection for her. Not far away, Cui Ying was already stunned. Her eyes were wide open, and she kept tugging at her second brother's sleeve. But she couldn't say anything. She originally wanted to slander AI Qing's appearance in front of Cui Ping, but after seeing the real person, she couldn't say anything. She smiled calmly, walked between the guests, and politely nodded to the guests. When she passed by Huai Shi, her eyes didn't stop, as if she was looking at a stranger. Huai Shi wanted to open his mouth to speak, but when she glanced at him, he was stunned and couldn't say anything. In this way, he watched her leave him little by little, going to the front and finally to her great-grandfather's side. Sorry, I'm a little late. She apologized to the guests naturally and graciously, and raised a small palm-sized box in her hand. The gift for the old man has arrived. I went to get it. Soon, in the hands of the servant, the gift box was opened, and the bright light illuminated everyone's eyes. In the velvet cushion in the center of the box there was a bright crystal the size of the knuckle of the little finger. The delicate gem glowed with soft and warm light, and the faint sound of hymns sounded from the air. The sacred and pure melody played in everyone's ears. Divine light of grace? Some people had recognized the gift, and they couldn't believe it. It was a precious treasure from Rome, a faith crystal that could save lives, and not inferior to an expensive consumable of a high-level stigmata. As long as it was worn close to the body, there was no doubt that it was a miracle gem that could save one's life. After a brief moment of astonishment, there was congratulatory applause and blessings. Even the old man was stunned for a moment, and then he laughed. He reached out and patted Ai Qing's shoulder, and his old heart was comforted. It seems that my great-granddaughter has grown up and knows how to care for your great-grandfather. Whether this was Ai Qing's performance of bowing her head and admitting defeat, or if she had other plans, he didn't mind at all. As long as she could have a little sense of belonging to the family, it was enough. Even if it was a performance, it didn't matter. Wasn't most things in this world a performance? As long as the old man is happy. Ai Qing smiled, raised her hand, and took off the bracelet on her wrist. Then, she got up from the wheelchair and stood in front of her great-grandfather. As the silver bracelet came off, waves of origin substance emerged from her body. She reached out and picked up the divine light of grace in the box, and the power from her soul enveloped the crystal condensed by the miracle. Between her 5 fingers, the shadow of a handgun slowly emerged, aimed at the old man's face. Yin Liangji's smile stiffened. In the brief moment of silence, Ai Qing thought for a moment and said seriously, "I wish you a long life, great-grandfather." Bang! There was a soft sound. She pulled the trigger. The crystallization of faith turned into bullets of calamity. Blazing radiance burst forth and vanished in a flash, easily tearing apart the defenses and obstacles in front of them. Immediately afterwards, blood spurted out, dyeing her palms and cheeks red. In the dead silence, Yin Liangji fell on his back. There was no more sound. Only the young girl, who was no longer smiling, raised her face, and a brilliant flame appeared in her green-gold eyes, looking down at the pair of eyes that had been stunned until death. After 7 long years of waiting, her origin substance was finally released from its shackles, revealing its appearance here. Soul, the eye of liberation. She was free. Chapter 304. In the sudden silence, everyone was stunned. Not only did the already dead Yin Liangji not react, even Yin Ye and the third-order sublimator who had been secretly protecting Yin Liangji did not expect this at all. When all the guards were locked onto Huaishur, Ai Qing became a sublimator. Ai Qing drew her gun, and Ai Qing pulled the trigger. First blood. The miracle of the divine light of grace was perfectly transformed into a fleeting and violent power. The miracle of bringing life pierced through one's head, instantly tearing apart one's will, destroying any trace of consciousness, and bringing about a perfect death. Along with the sound of gunfire and the spread of blood, there was an indescribable sense of absurdity. A scene that was enough to shock the loving mothers of all the guests for an entire year suddenly appeared. Just like death itself, blood dripped from her fingertip. Ai Qing lowered her pair of bright eyes, coldly staring at her great-grandfather's lifeless face. She wondered if he had comprehended his great-granddaughter's growth at the very last moment. Since a month ago, when the damned premonition came, she had been silently preparing for this moment. Among the countless plans she had prepared for this, it had never been so smooth and natural. Natural and smooth. It was as if she was born to be like this. She fulfilled the mission that was given to her from the day her mother passed away without any mistakes. She finally had the courage that Huaishur had envied. In such a decisive and intense way, she ended the old ghost who had controlled her for half her life. It was all over. Whether it was a conspiracy or revenge, the grudge between the Hwai clan and the Een clan would come to an end with this shot. When she woke up from the calmness that had frightened her, she breathed out the last of the uneasiness in her heart. She finally experienced the peace and relaxation that Hwai Shur had once described. "So happy," she whispered softly, her blood-stained cheeks curved into a smile. It came from the bottom of her heart, causing her originally excessively pale and sickly face to become lively and lively. She felt her heartbeat and pulse, as well as her intoxicating breathing. She was still alive. He could finally live for himself. Then, she heard a roar that broke the dead silence. Impudent! With anger and shock that anyone who wasn't deaf could understand, a figure suddenly rushed forward, grabbed her hand, and violently pressed her to the ground. Hwai Shur's eyes widened in righteous indignation as he angrily rebuked, "That's insane! How dare you murder such a respected old man in front of me, a member of the Astronomical Society?" A pair of handcuffs that had just been made were fastened on her hands that were tied behind her back. Before anyone could react, Hwai Shur had already pressed down on Ai Ching and announced in a trembling voice, "The suspect is Ai Ching, the inspector of the Astronomy Society stationed in Xian High. You are under arrest." As he spoke, he raised his head and flung out his Astronomy Association ID. He drew his sword and glared at the crowd. Heaven's net has a wide net, but nothing escapes it. Are there any of her accomplices here? If you want to violently resist the law, quickly step forward. A passing member of the Astronomical Society stepped forward after encountering such a cruel murder case and quickly arrested the suspect, Ai Ching. This demonstrated the terrifying efficiency and dignity of the Astronomical Society that could not be underestimated. It was simply awe-inspiring. If it wasn't for the fact that the faces of the Een family members looked like they had eaten **T. In this continuous shock, someone subconsciously raised his hand and said, "Wait a minute, I think," bang! An invisible heavy axe penetrated from Hwai Shur's hand and deeply wedged into the wall next to his head. Hwai Shur looked at him coldly. "What, do you want to turn yourself in?" So, that person immediately shut up. In the dead silence, Chui Ying looked around blankly, still unable to react. She opened her mouth to speak, but Chui Ping suddenly pressed on her shoulder. "Second brother? Don't talk. Don't get involved in the Astronomical Society's business." In just a few seconds, this Chui family's horse had already understood the cause and effect and made a decision. Hwai Shur had already used the Astronomical Society's name to arrest criminal members, so this matter had become a family affair of the Astronomical Society in disguise. The victim just happened to be a member of the Een family. If he wanted to speak up and get involved, he had to consider whether he had the weight to please both sides. At this time, other than the Een family members who could stop it, only the higher-ups of the Astronomical Society could speak up. But was there anyone from the Astronomical Society here? Yes. There was the nemesis of crime, the inspector of Xinhai, Ai Ching. There was also Hwai Shur, a member of the Xinhai operation, a prince of paradise, a disaster musician, an official culinary demon, and a legendary investigator. He was also a golden cowherd, Hwai Shur. There was no one who could expose Hwai Shur's tiger skin. After using the fastest reaction speed to obtain the right to dispose of Ai Ching, Hwai Shur looked around coldly. He roughly pulled Ai Ching up and took a step back, then another step, stepping over the gradually cold corpse on the ground. The expressions of all the Een family members present changed. On the round table, Een Xing's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to speak. Beside her, Een Yen picked up a plate expressionlessly and slammed it on his cousin's face, stuffing her bullshit words back into her stomach. "In this situation, there's no place for you to embarrass yourself." Enya did not speak. He only silently stared at Ai Ching in Hwai Shur's hand. AI Qing was also looking at him, her expression calm. At such a close distance, being stared at by a level 4 ascendant, Huai Shi felt like there was a blade on his back, as if he had fallen into an ice cave. As long as Enya wanted to, he could kill Huai Shi on the spot with a flick of his finger. But he did not make a move, nor did he speak. He only looked at his most beloved sister, the veins on the back of his hand bulging. He condensed a violent killing intent to her neck, but he could not do it. Huai Shi raised his hand and stood in front of AI Qing. His sharp gaze swept over Qin Wentian's body. Wherever his gaze passed, his flesh and blood would be torn apart before quickly closing up again. Only fresh blood could be seen dripping down. A jade-green ghost fire ignited in his eyes. Facing an invincible enemy, Hill Ghost had already made his choice. In that instant, the furious shadows in the darkness suddenly converged into a torrent, rising up like a tsunami. Countless shadows collided, rubbing against each other and shooting out sparks. A peak level 3 ascendant. The shadow guard from the graveyard of the returnless, the gate of benevolence, had attacked in rage. The darkness rumbled, and the condensed shadows intertwined with each other, turning into a cage that instantly swallowed Huai Shi and the others. Countless shadows took on a physical form, strangling and closing in. But there was a soft sound. It was like an illusion. In that instant, the entire banquet hall trembled slightly, and a small crack appeared in the wall. An extremely thin and dim bolt of lightning flashed, sinking into the surging tide of shadows. The next moment, amidst the rumbling of the wall collapsing, a shrill roar burst out from the tide of shadows, piercing everyone's eardrums. The layers of darkness suddenly collapsed, as if struck by an invisible hammer. On the walls of the hall, the broken bricks suddenly collapsed like gravel, leaving only a large circular hole with a diameter of several meters, nesting the crack in the tide of shadows. The bolt of lightning slowly dissipated. Whether it was the heavy shadows, the condensed power, or even the soul and stigmata of the furious level 3 ascendant, they were all pierced by the alchemy bullet that came from far away. It exploded with a loud bang. Viscous blood splattered and spread out. The mutilated headless corpse fell to the ground, landing next to Yin Liangji's corpse, to accompany him to the afterlife. On a mountaintop more than 10 kilometers away, in the forest, behind a huge sniper rifle that was more than 2 meters long, a bald cowherd who didn't want to reveal his name pulled the bolt, ejected the bullet, and loaded a crystal-like alchemy bullet into the chamber. The finger that was placed on the trigger had already ruptured, and blood was seeping out. Even with several layers of shock-absorbing equipment, the sharp pains spread from his shoulder. Right now, his body was no longer able to withstand the recoil of this terrifying weapon. "Little sister, you have the guts to walk forward. Don't look back, don't look back." Yu Dongri stared at the X-ray image in the sniper scope, tilted his head, lit the cigarette at the corner of his mouth, and hummed an out-of-tune ballad. He opened the notebook next to him and typed in the updated data changes. The distance was corrected again, the wind speed was measured, the wind direction was south, the air pressure was unchanged, the temperature was normal. He put it into the formula, did the complicated calculations, and finally deducted the deviation caused by the Earth's rotation speed. In the sniper scope, the crosshair began to adjust and change subtly. He was ready again. He laughed softly. "Don't be afraid, Big Brother will protect you. See. Don't act rashly. This place has been surrounded by our astronomy club." Although he didn't know what had happened, Huai Shi still intended to leave some harsh words here. Taking advantage of the chaos, he retreated to the outermost side of the hall with AI Qing and kicked open the door. Sunlight rushed in like a waterfall, stinging everyone's eyes. Then, he waved his sword, and a white horse from the paradise came over with a majestic pace. Casually, he threw AI Qing onto the horse's back. Huai Shi took one last look at Enya, got on the horse, pulled the reins, and prepared to leave. 15 minutes. He heard Enya's voice behind him. "Little Qing, This is the last sibling relationship I have with you. In the deepest part of the banquet hall, Enya sat on a chair with his back to them and finally said, after 15 minutes, the Yin family and you will fight to the death. Ai Ching smiled and didn't say anything. Huai Shi was stunned for a moment. He pulled the reins, and the white horse neighed and galloped down the mountain. The sound of horse hooves gradually faded into the distance. In the dead silence, no one spoke again. Dear guests, I'm very sorry for encountering such an unfortunate thing after coming all the way here. Enya said softly, the Yin family can't entertain guests today. Please help yourselves. I'll come to apologize another day. The guests who were finally released from suffocation surged and quickly left in the direction of the gate. After collecting great-grandfather's body, you guys should go back and rest first. He raised his eyes and looked at his uncles and siblings. Fourth grandpa is old and wise. I'll have to trouble you with great-grandfather's funeral. As for the others, watch your hands and mouth. Don't embarrass yourself. Enya nodded and took the lead to leave. The other young people followed in a hurry. Only from a distance did they hear crying. It was unknown whether it was from sadness or fear. In the end, Enya sat quietly in the empty banquet hall and stared at the blood on the ground. After a long, long time, he lowered his head, picked up his phone, and dialed the number he had dialed a long time ago. After 3 busy tones, the call was connected. Reward Ai Ching. Enya paused for a moment and opened his mouth to say something, but in the end, his lips were tightly pursed and he didn't want to speak. The call was connected, and the person on the other end waited quietly and calmly. Until a hoarse voice came. Quota, $400 million. Enya closed his eyes. Dead or alive? The call was hung up. Chapter 305. Noon, 12:45 a.m. 3:45 a.m. A terrifying bounty that had not been seen in the past 6 years spread like wildfire through all of the channels in the collection of 10,000 sins. After taking 1/10 of the bounty, the largest intermediary platform in the dark side of the sublimata world took all of the bounty and sent it to the eastern part of Dongxia. The bounty of death notices turned into pop-up windows and text messages that appeared in the phones of every registered person in Dongxia. It didn't matter if they were sublimators or not, where they worked, or who they were. More notices were sent out in all directions through the dark net, delivering the notice of a high reward to every senior member. $400 million. Dozens of actuaries completed the liquidation of the bounty within half an hour. They converted 1/3 of the shares in the border region into cash, no more, no less, and began to transfer and purchase them. Enough money to allow an sublimator to live a luxurious life for the rest of their lives had been poured into the bounty pool. As long as the bounty target was brought to a place that even had a Wi-Fi connection to the collection of 10,000 sins, they would be able to obtain this sum of money. When the pop-up window appeared on the screen, there was a brief moment of silence, followed by a wave of commotion. So that's how it is? In a short 3 minutes, the entire process was laid out on eldest cousin's desk. Zhu Hongqian flipped through the report in shock for a long time before he couldn't help but laugh self-mockingly. Should I call him resolute and decisive, or rash and reckless? But no matter what, it's still very satisfying. Can you stop watching the show? Doom third sighed and slammed another stack of reports on the table in front of him. 10 minutes ago, the chainsaw ghoul entered the discovery realm. Apparently, the Eye of Nightmares is also showing signs of activity. The border sensors have also captured the movements of 6 other wanted criminals, as well as more than 16 border mercenary groups. This is within Dongxia's territory, and it's heading towards our territory. You can't possibly not react at all, right? React? What kind of reaction do you want? Eldest cousin was amused and turned to look at her. Shouldn't we do what we should do? Those who break the law will be captured, and those who are guilty will be killed. Those who dare to resist will be served with missiles and mortars. Those who are captured dead will be sent to Jixia as specimens. Those who are captured alive will be sent to Jixia as test subjects. As for those who haven't broken the law in Dongxia, what can we do? Are they prohibited from entering the country? Are we just going to ignore everything? Yes, of course. Big Cousin spun the lighter between his fingers. As we all know, Dongxia is a place that prohibits individuals from possessing firearms and knives. I really hope they don't carry any prohibited items. As he spoke, he couldn't help but chuckle softly. I really like this young man, Huaishir. Look at him. He alone has created so many collective third-class merits for us. There are even pictures of this year's advanced role models. Go and see if there's anyone else who hasn't hitchhiked before. Hurry up and catch them. Once the fishing season is over, it'll be hard to catch them. While Big Cousin was laughing happily, in the huge underground facility of the Jinling Social Security Bureau, lights lit up one by one, and hurried footsteps ran in all directions. The largest sublimator violence mechanism in the entire eastern part of Dongxia was operating at full force. Full of anticipation. More ascendants, more assassins, and more border mercenaries were like flies in the latrine, bamboo shoots after the rain, and customers outside the supermarkets on Black Friday. They kept making their moves. Under the temptation of the 400 million reward, which was directly linked to the huge reward of source-form crystals, they flocked over. Half an hour later, in the wilderness, Huaishir expressionlessly pulled the axe out of the head of the guy who had just drilled out of the ground. Then, he turned around and picked through the messy corpses on the ground. He pulled out a usable shotgun, hung it on the saddle, pulled the white horse's reins, and continued forward. On the horse's back, Ai Qing raised her eyes to recognize the sunlight with a calm expression. Jinling isn't in this direction, she asked. You're not sending me to the astronomy meeting? Defection is a heavier crime than murder. Do you understand? Huaishir didn't say anything and continued forward. This is only the first batch of people who moved the fastest. Even if my cousin doesn't do it himself, he will definitely set up a reward. More and more people will come to our door later. The woman on the horse raised her eyes and stared straight at the sun, as if she could see the countless satellites in low Earth orbit aimed at them. She waved her hand slightly. Where are you going to take me? Ai Qing asked. The nearest public border entrance is at least 200 kilometers away from here. Or do you just want to elope with me? Huaishir ignored her. She paused for a moment, and her expression became subtle. She seemed to be smiling. You know I was supposed to get engaged today, right? If I didn't come, your funeral would have been held today. Huaishir replied indifferently. Don't imagine that someone will come back and blow up the axle of your wedding car. A woman like you won't be able to get married. Ai Qing's expression didn't change. She just asked calmly, I just want to consult Mr. Huaishir of the astronomy meeting about the escape plan. Just shut up. Huaishir turned his head. For the first time since leaving the Yin family, he looked into Ai Qing's eyes and told her word by word, don't talk anymore. Ai Qing seemed to have caught a glimpse of the anger in those eyes. It was rare for her to be obedient. She didn't say anything else. Or rather, she already knew the answer. She raised her head and faced the wind blowing from afar. Her long hair fluttered in the wind. The wilderness seemed to be endless. There was no end in sight. It's so free. Ai Qing whispered softly. Even if this freedom was so illusory and short. In the distance, smoke and dust rose. An off-road vehicle crossed the mountains and whistled over. It stopped in front of the white horse. The middle-aged man driving the car stared at the two through the glass. He lowered his head and looked at his phone, comparing it with the photo on it. He pushed open the door and got out. He pulled out a heavy halberd from the back of the car and held it with both hands. He blocked in front of the white horse. Don't block the way. Huaishir's hand pressed on the sword of virtue. I was just lucky and happened to be camping nearby. There are more people behind. the man with the halberd replied. Even if I make way, you can't pass. So you won't let me? So, why don't you let me try? A phantom appeared behind the ascendant who blocked the way. An identical version of himself walked out from the body, holding the same halberd. There was no difference between them. Dongxia genealogy, Tantai Jiao. The two figures who looked like twins said in unison, if you really have the confidence to take her away, you might as well treat this as a warm-up. Huai Shi stepped forward, pulled out the sword of virtue, and stepped forward to meet the two phantoms who were fading at the same time. At that moment 2 overlapping roars burst out. With a roar, the two figures of Tantai Jiao instantly disappeared from where they were. They plowed a deep crack in the ground and pointed straight at Huai Shi. The halberd screeched and set off a mournful howl from the almost identical resonance. The iron light flashed and disappeared. Huai Shi raised his wrist, and the blade slashed down. Forward. He sheathed the sword. Behind him, the two figures slid to the ground. A crack appeared on the halberd in their hands and on their chests at the same time. And in the air in front of Huai Shi, blood spurted out. The real Tantai Jiao staggered back. She couldn't believe how Huai Shi saw through the real doppelganger created by the combination of her soul power and the impermanence's stigmata. After holding your breath, the sound of your pulse became louder. Huai Shi raised his hand and rubbed his ears. It hurt my ears. Tantai Jiao froze for a moment, then fell to the ground with a bitter smile. Thank you for showing mercy. No, you're too weak. I can still hold back. Huai Shi turned around, took the reins of the white horse, and continued forward. He heard Tantai Jiao's voice behind him. There are still people waiting for you ahead. Huai Shi, you can't go far. Huai Shi's footsteps paused for a moment. He didn't speak and continued forward. After flowing through the stream, he saw the figure sitting on the shore, waiting for a long time. It was unexpectedly familiar. I see Amber in here. The long-lost girl closed the lid of the lunchbox and looked up with a smile. You know I'm a border hunter, right? There are many missions. Huai Shi said. It doesn't have to be this one. Amber shook her head. But I need money. I can give it to you. Huai Shi tried to negotiate. Even if you don't think it's enough, with my current status, I can still borrow a lot. Eh? You're working so hard for your boss? Li Jian glanced at Ai Qing on horseback and smiled mischievously. Unfortunately, I don't want the money you're giving me. She slowly got up and casually hung her coat on a branch nearby, revealing the sports vest inside and the sword belt hanging at her waist. There were 2 katanas and a wakizashi. Don't you want to wait? Huai Shi asked. I beat Luo Xian. Are you sure you can do it like this? A victory won't count as a victory won't be counted. Don't be too proud, Huai Shi. Amber shook her head and slowly pushed the katana out of the sheath with her thumb. Her smile became sweeter. By the way, there's actually no need to wait, she said, because there are too many people. We discussed it and decided to go in order. I'm the luckiest. I'm second. Huai Shi couldn't help but laugh. He looked around and vaguely saw a few figures waiting in the depths of the forest. His eyes became mocking. You're going to beat me like this? Yes. Amber nodded. A clear voice burst out from the sheath and stung Huai Shi's eardrums. She said, I'm going to beat you. In an instant she was close by. It was the same as Huai Shi's. You step. No, it was even more mature and efficient than Huai Shi's you step. After combining the steps of Ingzhou swordsmanship, it had taken on a different appearance. After discarding the other unimportant elements, only the most violent explosive power was left. Using all the strength in the body, gathering into a beam, integrating the strength that had long surpassed the imagination of ordinary people into the skills that had been tempered thousands of times. In an instant the katana was unsheathed. Separated by 5 steps, the blade that was originally only a little more than 3 feet suddenly grew to more than 2 meters. However, the speed became more and more astonishing as it was swung. It was as bright as a shooting star. In an instant the light tore through people's eyes. Revolving heaven-y sword dance combo. Chapter 306. A mournful sound suddenly burst forth. From Huai Shi's hand, the spear of compassion shot forward, the cross-shaped spear blade blocking the sword's slashing trajectory without any warning. But then he saw the blade suddenly shrink, instantly shrinking by a meter without any reason. After bypassing the spear's interception without any obstruction, it shot out like a viper. Huai Shi leaned back and saw the sharp blade sweep past the tip of his nose. When he abruptly propped himself up, he saw the blade that swept past him suddenly shrink again. The originally astonishing speed actually increased once more. From Hu Po's spin, it drew an arc lightly and chopped down from top to bottom. This time, following the slashing of the blade, not only did its length increase explosively, even its weight increased by 10 to 20 times. The sound of air being torn apart exploded. Bang! The axe of wrath was lifted up and collided with the blade. Huai Shi actually felt a wave of numbness in his hand. But Hu Po's movements didn't stop. Her feet crossed and she took a step forward, borrowing the momentum from her nimble spin to sweep across again. The strength of the blade was even greater than before. The sound of metal colliding continuously burst forth. Huai Shi retreated pathetically, but Hu Po stepped forward step by step. It was as if she was dancing, waving her sword in her crisscrossing footsteps. This was a sword dance that was formed by the combination of a sword technique that had been brought to the point of perfection and soul power. This power was endlessly stacked and transformed into a sword dance. The sword dance continued. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. The more she dodged, the more terrifying the strength of the sword dance became. From the spinning of heaven and earth, it established an unstoppable strength. From the moment the sword dance began, the initiative was already in her hands. By the time Huai Shi understood what was going on, a green hue had already spread all over her arm. She swung her axe with all her might, creating an insignificant gap in the sword dance. Huai Shi drove straight in. Ignoring the rapidly shrinking blade that doubled in weight, the strength of the drummer burst forth, bombarding her abdomen at close range. Boom! A blood-red armor appeared on her body without any warning, forcibly taking on Huai Shi's punch that was like a pile driver. Inside the amber roared and pulled out another tachi from its sheath. Drawing the sword. The power gathered in the sword dance followed the guidance of the arm and poured into the blade of the tachi. The power that had been accumulated for a long time turned into an invincible speed, bursting out from the scabbard. A fierce light flashed. Huai Shi took a step back, and cracks appeared on the sacrificial knife. Not only was his defensive stance broken, but he was also about to lose his grip on the hilt of his sword. "It's over, Huai Shi." Inside, Hu Po roared and swung his twin swords. "Yes, it's over." At the last moment, Huai Shi heaved a sigh of relief and forcibly raised the sword of virtue. The powerful chop was blocked by the sword of virtue. It was a piece of cake. There was only a crisp sound. Slap. The 2 sabers left his hands. Hu Po staggered back and fell to the ground, gasping for breath with all her might. It was only now that she saw the irises that had grown out of nowhere under her feet. They were so pure white and beautiful. Too despicable. She took off her helmet and raised her head with difficulty. "You actually used poison." Huai Shi casually applied a layer of silver blood potion on the wound between his thumb and index finger. He shrugged slightly and looked at her with pity. "Girl, times have changed." As he spoke, he raised his hand and knocked on the back of her neck. It was over. Huai Shi turned around and wanted to lead the horse, but he suddenly felt a premonition of death behind him. He suddenly turned back, stretched out his hand, and clenched his 5 fingers. He grabbed the arrow that was whistling towards him. Between his 5 fingers, the arrow was still buzzing, and the tip was only a hair's breadth away from Huai Shi's eyes. In the depths of the forest, the gray-robed figure didn't hit the target. He immediately pulled out an arrow stuck in the ground beside his feet and shot again. The arrow's trajectory was erratic and strange, like a ghost appearing and disappearing from the dense forest. It was already right in front of him, but for some reason, Huaishur felt that the other party's actions were simply childish to the point of somewhat comical. Even if he had never touched that kind of weapon, he instinctively felt that the bow wasn't used like that. Bang! The sword of virtue swept across, directly cutting the arrow that had strangely appeared behind his head in two. In the next instant, Huaishur's figure had already disappeared from where he was, submerging into the dense forest. The dark green flames of the mountain ghost instantly ignited from his body. The gray-robed man was stunned for a moment. He actually carried his bow on his back, turned around, and fled. It looked like he wanted to fight a prolonged guerrilla war with Huaishur. Unfortunately, in the dense forest, guerrilla war with a mountain ghost? Are you sure you're not mistaken? In the blink of an eye, Huaishur had already flown out from the thistles and thorns. With a sudden swing of his sword, he nailed the gray-robed man to the tree trunk. Then, he heard a crackling sound beside him. In the darkness, the originally empty scene instantly shattered, revealing a dozen figures hidden behind the encirclement, as well as the automatic weapons in their hands that had already been unlocked. Huaishur was stunned for a moment. He looked back at the twitching archer on the tree trunk and immediately understood. An ambush! In the next instant, the gunfire of the mercenaries at the border burst forth. In the depths of the dense forest, there were continuous loud noises, as if bombs were constantly being detonated. On the white horse, Ai Qing quietly looked at the thick smoke rising from the forest in the distance. But soon, she turned her head slightly and looked behind her. Her slender eyebrows raised slightly. "Didn't you say to come one by one?" "Originally, that's what I said." A stooped old man was dragging a heavy chainsaw behind him. Ai Qing looked over, and under his excessively sparse white hair, he squeezed out a wriggling smile on his ugly face. He chuckled strangely, "But I don't agree." The chainsaw that he was dragging behind him still carried the stench of blood and broken bone fragments. It was as if countless people's screams were entangled in it. Layers of suspicious leather were wrapped around the handle. It was almost emitting substantial resentment and hostility. There was no doubt that it was a border relic that was close to evil. Even if it had been stained with blood not long ago, it was still crying out hungrily at this moment. The white horse turned slightly and let out a low roar. Its eyes were vigilant. The iron hooves under its feet knocked on the rocks intermittently, and sparks burst forth. It exhaled hot breaths. It was as if a charge was imminent. It seems that he has really left." The stooped old man who dragged the chainsaw chuckled. His expression twitched, and his pupils, which had shrunk to the size of a needle, stared at Ai Qing. He panted roughly. 400 million, 400 million, and it doesn't matter if he's dead or alive. Such good meat, child, such good meat." In his hand, the chainsaw suddenly roared hungrily. It spun wildly, and blood spurted out from the chainsaw. "Chainsaw ghoul, Horgus?" The woman on the horse raised her eyebrows, as if she was surprised by her current charm. "Are you really sure that I have no power to resist?" Yes, please resist at will," Horgus laughed sharply. He grinned, revealing his sharp teeth that still had food residue hanging on them. "This child is quite fond of struggling prey," the chainsaw roared. So Ai Qing nodded. "Okay." At that moment the white horse neighed. Under the control of Ai Qing's horsemanship, which was obviously much better than Huaishur's, it galloped forward. It raised its iron hooves to face the spinning chainsaw. Its huge eyes were full of disdain. "I'll kick you to death, you old pervert!" In an instant, Horgus collapsed into a stinking mist. It suddenly boiled, swept past the white horse, and reformed in midair. It was the chainsaw that slashed down on Ai Qing's face. Ai Qing was expressionless. She pulled out the shotgun that Huai Shi had left behind from the saddle and aimed it at the old man's ferocious face. The trigger was pulled. Dark purple light gushed out from the ordinary-looking shotgun. In an instant, it tore through the air and turned into a torrential rain, instantly defeating Horgus. Horgus turned back into smoke and retreated in a sorry state. When he reappeared, his face was already covered with a layer of pockmarked scars. Now that you've opened your mouth, you must want to ask what that was just now. Ai Qing replied expressionlessly, Actually, it doesn't matter if I tell you. My soul is called the Eye of Liberation. It can stimulate and use my own sapphira and any sapphira crystal in the most violent way. The simplest way is an explosion. If it's restrained and triggered at the same time, it can form the effect of a firearm. She paused and asked seriously, Now, you must have experienced my disdain just now, right? The young girl pulled the bolt and aimed it at his face again. To be honest, an old pervert like you who hasn't taken a bath for who knows how long, just looking at you makes me feel so disgusted that I'm about to throw up. Horgus' expression twitched. The chainsaw in his hand let out a hungry roar. It was obvious that he was unable to restrain his anger. But immediately afterwards, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around in astonishment. In the middle of the burning forest, amidst the rising smoke, the returning mountain ghost dragged his axe and walked out of the flames step by step. He revealed a ferocious smile at the old man. I just left for a while, and another guest came? Yes, a rare evil guest. He has a bounty of at least $170 million on him. Ai Qing let out a long sigh and put down the gun. Her face was pale. Just putting on an act has already used up all of my strength. That bullet just now had already used up all of her origin substance. It's fine. The mountain ghost, who had exceeded his limit, slightly twisted his neck, and a crisp sound burst forth from his joints. I'll take care of him. Sensing the fluctuations of origin substance erupting from the newcomer's chest like a volcano, even Horgus, who had been at the peak of the third rank for several decades, changed his expression. He became more and more incredulous. Why was he so strong? And why was he so fast? An entire border mercenary group. Even if it was impossible for everyone to be ascendants, even if there were 19 pigs carrying guns and cannons on their backs, they should be able to last at least 15 minutes if they were left to be killed. It's very simple. Huai Shi held the sword of virtue and the sacrificial knife upside down with both hands and propped himself up. In place, he assumed a lunging posture. When he raised his head, the corners of his mouth revealed a happy expression that even the ghouls were frightened. Of course, that's because I'm stronger than you bunch of trash. In that instant, the chainsaw suddenly shook and let out a terrified shriek and wail. Chapter 307. At that moment, Horgus felt as if he had been struck by lightning. Not only was he shocked by the murderous intent, but he was also horrified by the evil chainsaw in his hand under the gaze of that handsome face. It was a terrifying experience that he had never had before. When he dug out this chainsaw from the American ruins, he couldn't help but be infected by the endless hunger and ferocity contained in the chainsaw. He was intoxicated by the murmurs that kept ringing in his ears, and he grew older and stranger day by day. Even though he was spurned and despised because of his depravity, this power was so powerful and violent that no words could slander it. He, who was connected to the chainsaw by blood, had long become an evil beast in the abyss, feeding on blood. Like a symbiotic relationship, he provided the chainsaw with blood, and the chainsaw provided him with power. But now, he felt an unprecedented fear from the chainsaw's constantly fluctuating ferocious source substance. It was as if he had glimpsed the essence of something more ferocious and crazy than himself through that blood-stained face. He was being watched by malice and predators from a higher dimension that were immersed in the depths of the darkness. He was shivering. He stepped back in shock and blinked in disbelief. He tried to see the gradually blurring figure again, but after a moment of darkness, Huai Shi's smiling face had already appeared in front of him. It was so clear and so cold. It was close at hand. He looked at Horgus's twisted face and smiled. "What are you looking at?" In front of Horgus, he raised his palm and clenched his 5 fingers. His iron-green skin revealed traces of scarlet, like iron that had been heated red. He swung his fist. The drummers roared. Horgus subconsciously wanted to block the chainsaw in front of him, but before he could raise his hand, he felt his vision go black. It was as if he had been hit head-on by a speeding truck, and he flew backward. The muscles on Huai Shi's arm burst and quickly healed again. The broken skin healed again, and only a trace of blood-colored mist rose. Huai Shi stepped forward. From the broken rocks, Horgus screamed and struggled to climb out, but then he felt his body rising up involuntarily. This was because a hand had already grabbed his head and pulled him up from the ground. It was as if someone had pulled out a carrot. His 5 fingers slowly tightened. His skull groaned in pain. Under the infusion of the ashes and deadly poison, Horgus screamed crazily and waved his chainsaw randomly, resisting without any pattern. But then, the screams turned into roars. This was because countless blood vessels suddenly extended out from the chainsaw and sank into his body. They crazily extracted his flesh and blood, making rumbling noises. The metal and bone chainsaw began to operate crazily. Eyes appeared on the back of the chainsaw, covered in blood vessels. They looked around randomly and finally landed on Huai Shi. Horgus turned ghastly pale. His face was bloodless. Because the blood had turned into scarlet flames on the chainsaw, the gluttony's chainsaw swung horizontally and collided with the axe of wrath. Sparks flew everywhere. "Eat, eat. I want to eat." In midair, Horgus twisted randomly like a spider. Ignoring the sound of his cervical vertebrae breaking, he broke free from Huai Shi's shackles. He landed on the ground and crawled on his hands and feet. He was very fast. The gluttony's chainsaw, which had fused into one, drilled into his bones and merged his entire arm into the chainsaw. The ghoul had been eroded by this ferocious border relic and turned into an inhuman ferocious monster. It roared hoarsely at Huai Shi. It was as if this could scare the enemy away. What answered it was the axe blade that cut down. With the friction of the enchanted gloves, the dark gray lightning formed by the qualitative change of the elemental substance adhered to it, and thunder burst out as Huai Shi jumped and hacked. Amidst the rumbling, cracks appeared on the flying chain, and fine bone fragments splattered everywhere. Horgus hugged the axe blade without caring about his own safety, raised the chainsaw that had merged into his right arm, and hacked at Huai Shi's face. The axe blade dissipated in an instant. The sacrificial knife was waved horizontally, wedged between the rotating blades. Then, the sword of virtue was raised and slashed forward. It tore through Horgus's chest like a hot knife through butter, opening up a huge gash. Stinking blood splattered everywhere. The deformed body flew backward, but then countless teeth emerged from the gash in his chest, and the deformed internal organs were flung out of the gash like long tongues. His entire chest cavity had become a hungry maw, and the chainsaw that had sunk into his body had turned into rapidly rotating teeth. His broken body suddenly propped itself up, and he lunged at Huai Shi again. Frenzied hunting, Huai Shi took a step back, and the lightning axe blade in his hand drew a nimble arc. He raised it and hacked at the monster that was pouncing at him. The crisp sound of a skull breaking rang out. Then, the electric light spread, causing the body that the gluttony's chainsaw parasitic to let out a paralyzed scream. With a wave of Huai Shi's hand, the sacrificial knife wedged itself into the gaping mouth on Horgus's chest. It frantically extracted all the blood and energy, turning it into gorgeous reliefs and crystals on the blade. Flesh and blood withered. The sword of virtue was held upside down, raised and stabbed down. It completely penetrated the monster's spine. The gluttony's chainsaw let out a sharp scream. Countless eyes fell apart and were destroyed by the glimmer of light on the blade. At the last moment, Horgus's broken face raised with difficulty. His crooked eyes stared at Huai Shi, full of resentment and fear. "What are you, the messenger of justice?" Huai Shi indifferently pulled out the blade and crushed the last trace of consciousness. The source form collapsed. The chainsaw ghoul met its end. In the dead silence, he looked around and asked expressionlessly, "Is there anything else?" The shadow under the grass and trees shook, but no one responded. "If there's nothing else, I'm leaving." Huai Shi sneered, sheathed his sword, and turned to walk towards the white horse. The shadow wriggled as if it was angry, but when Huai Shi looked back, it shrank back into the darkness like a frightened bird. Huai Shi shook his head, bent down, and washed the blood off his face with the gurgling stream. He took the white horse's reins and continued to move forward. Before leaving, Ai Qing seemed to inadvertently turn back and glance at the unconscious Hupu on the ground. They left. After a long, long time, in the shadow of the grass and trees, a pale man slowly crawled out. After taking off the Shadow Realm breathing device from the corner of his mouth, he panted violently. He was drenched in sweat. Just now he was almost killed. "Damn it, 400 million. Do you think you'll be alive to spend 400 million? The man looked down at the urging message on his phone and spat indignantly. After calling the agent who gave him this task and scolding him, he hung up the phone. The lingering fear still lingered. But soon, looking at the things scattered around, his eyes lit up again. No matter how small a mosquito was, it was still meat. He didn't come here for nothing. After stripping the dead people of their equipment, he turned back and looked at the unconscious girl on the ground. He rubbed his hands and couldn't help but gulp. His breathing quickened. "I guess you must have a bold idea." Hupu, who was supposed to be unconscious, suddenly opened his eyes and looked at him calmly. "I suggest you put away that bold idea, then put the things in your hands on the ground." The man was stunned for a moment. He picked up the things, turned around, and ran. Gunshots roared. He fell to the ground. Hupo expressionlessly put away a beautifully decorated flintlock gun, got up from the ground, and slowly picked up the equipment from the ground and piled them together. When she turned back to look at her lunchbox, she only saw the crushed remains and the rice balls that had fallen into the mud. "Cherish your food, bastard." She looked in the direction that Huai Shi had left in, and she was furious. The phone rang from her pocket. "Hello? Chief, yes, I've already fallen and almost died." Hupa tilted his head and lit a cigarette. He helplessly complained, "Why did you give me this kind of job that will only offend people? Isn't this the job of a temporary worker?" The eldest cousin on the phone laughed without any conscience. "Also, if third sister went, wouldn't the taste be completely different? After thinking about it, you're still the most suitable." Hupa sighed and flicked the ash from his cigarette. "I'm not afraid of offending people, but is there any use? Things like hinting are fine as long as they fall. If you say too much, you'll end up being a topic of ridicule. That little girl is so smart, she'll definitely understand, right?" "Who knows?" Hupa shrugged. "Yes, who knows?" After a moment of silence, Zhu Hongchen couldn't help but sigh. "I hope nothing happens to that young man. I'll be scolded by old man Xian Niao for interfering with the Astronomy Association's matters. This really isn't worth it." Hupa didn't respond to his words. He only smoked and quietly watched Huai Shi and the others escape in the direction they left in. He suddenly asked, "Do you think he'll really give up?" The eldest cousin didn't reply. Everyone knew the answer, but no one wanted to see that kind of result. In the end, Zhu Hongchen could only sigh. "It's been hard on you, Hupu. Isn't this the job of a temporary worker?" Hupa smoked his cigarette with a salted fish expression. He shook his head and sighed. "But it's still so frustrating. Not only did the ultimate move I painstakingly came up with not being able to be put to use, but I couldn't even beat Huai Shi. There's no justice in this world." Director, can you give this poor little hoopoe a raise on account of my mental trauma? Can you announce your praise and encourage everyone to learn from your achievements? Pretend I didn't say anything. Hoopoe curled his lips and unhappily hung up the phone. He quietly finished his cigarette and stamped it out. He picked up the spoils of war and turned around to leave. But as he walked, he couldn't help but turn around to look behind him. He didn't know if it was envy or pity. "Good luck, Your Highness," she softly muttered. "There really isn't much time left for you." Chapter 308. With a roar, the flames rose. Thick smoke covered the sun, and only the dancing red light illuminated every stunned face in the car window. Then, the white horse's neigh sounded from a distance. At the end of the highway, everyone saw a white figure as vigorous as a dragon running up and over the broken bridge. The iron hooves trampled and instantly crushed the broken window, crushing the grinning face. Blood splattered. Huai Shi on the white horse raised his arm, and the force of the white horse gathered on his wrist. The spear of compassion stabbed forward, tearing the outside of the armored car like cutting paper, and penetrating deeply into it. After leaving the iris seed, it dissipated in the air. On the road, the rampaging car suddenly turned around and tried to give chase again, but soon, it gradually slowed down as it sped along. It was like a giant beast that was being bled. Finally, it stopped on the side of the road. The armored car suddenly shook and was buried in the sudden burst of flames. It was ignited by the spurting flames, blocking the cars behind it. Countless sharp horns brushed past him. On the highway where the roaring sound came one after another, Huai Shi pulled the reins and began to heroically go against the flow in the white horse's neigh. The iron hooves trampled and crushed the asphalt road under their feet. The white horse galloped like the wind. The long mane swayed in the wind, as fierce as a flag. "Be careful in front," Ai Qing behind him reminded in a low voice, and then there was the loud sound of a huge truck drifting and sweeping. Just in front, the heavy giant truck suddenly threw off the outer camouflage shell, revealing the body painted with scarlet graffiti. In the noisy rap, the driver in the driver's seat turned the steering wheel frantically, stepped on the brakes, and swept out the huge tail like a weapon. It was like a rough arm sweeping across a toy plate. After overturning a few cars in front, the horizontal body blocked the white horse's path. Then, it slowly opened, revealing the heavy machine gun welded inside the cargo compartment. "Hey bro, try this." The dark-skinned machine gunner spat out the chewing gum in his mouth, and pulled the trigger with a grin. As the bullet chain rolled, a loud roar burst out from his hand. The red-hot metal whizzed out, tearing through the air. Like an endless whip of thunder and fire, it instantly swept towards Huai Shi. Then, he saw the appearance of the white horse leaping into the air. It was as if he was really flying in the wind. His speed was so fast that even the turning speed of the machine guns could not catch up to him. His speed was so fast that even the machine guns could not catch up to him. In just a few seconds, he had crossed a distance of more than 100 meters. The iron hooves stepped on the carriage. Looking at the dumbfounded face, the white horse snorted disdainfully and spat on the ground in an extremely human-like manner. Immediately afterward, the axe on the horse's back swept horizontally. After cutting off the entire top of the head, it also cut the machine gun that was still firing in the air into two. In the midst of the broken bullets, the white horse turned around and swept the pike of compassion, cutting the shell of the car with irresistible force and sending the two border war wild dogs next to it to the underworld. The explosion of the primordial substance flashed and disappeared. Ai Qing put down her hand. Through the thick armor, a figure that had pounced on her flew backward, his head on the ground. "They're all small fries. Don't get entangled with them," she said. "It should be the eye of nightmare. Those guys like to use cannon fodder to exhaust the strength of their prey before easily capturing them." Following her words, the white horse jumped out from the torn shell of the car again and landed on the ground. It nimbly jumped on the roofs of the cars and finally jumped up and stepped on the overpass. When he turned around, the highway behind him was already in a mess. As the flames spread, thick smoke billowed. The sight of the corpses of the wild dogs of war everywhere was enough to make the coldest white leftists feel heartache. Fortunately, thanks to the Social Security Bureau's extremely quick response and traffic control, this area had been sealed off. None of the people who barged in were innocent. Then, a roar came from the sky. Before that, a scarlet light lit up in the dark clouds that could not be dispelled in the sky. The winding curve outlined a blood-red eye symbol. Then, a huge steel ship broke out of the clouds. It was a distant illusion. The exploration ship, which was installed with the latest deep-diving engine, broke into the gap of the present realm from the closest border transit station. It maintained a safe distance from the external defense of the Doomsday system and only opened the door to the present realm by a sliver. Then, the light of a catapult flashed in the cabin that slowly opened. Thus, in the distant illusion, real steel fell from the sky. It rubbed against the air and burst out with blazing flames. Meteors fell. The frenzied roar spread in all directions. Then, a stream of flames spewed out from the falling piece of iron. Like a rocket landing, pieces of iron were constantly thrown off from the body and fell into the wind. They burned into scarlet liquid iron and scattered in all directions. In the end, the heavy iron shell finally fell from the sky and collapsed with a bang. The overpass shook violently. The sharp sound of steel rubbing against each other rang out. The burly figure half kneeling in it slowly raised his head. Only a pair of gray eyes could be seen on his face that was covered by a ferocious helmet. The newcomer's entire body was wrapped in well-tempered full-body armor. He held a flame-shaped sword and a dueling shield that were too heavy for ordinary people. He took a step forward with ease. He showed why sure the eye-shaped symbol on the shield. It represented the arrival of one of the most famous border mercenary groups in the Border and Hell, the Eye of Nightmare. Although it's a little unfair to compete with an opponent who has experienced such a battle, I hope you can understand, the Iron Knight said in a muffled voice. This means war. Why sure dismounted and looked around. Finally, he raised his eyes to look at the illusory shadow in the sky. He was full of doubts. If it's just you alone, it can't be considered war, right? I'm the one who made the request. The descender shrouded in steel said, if I can solve this bounty alone, then the army commander will personally dot the Eye of Nightmare on my shield. Beside his hand, the Eye of Nightmare symbol was empty on the dueling shield that was big enough to block his entire body. It represented his identity as an immature. Only those who were personally bestowed the Eye of Nightmare emblem by the army commander could become an official member of this Hell Army. Before that, no matter how long they served, no matter what kind of war they participated in, or how many enemies they reaped, if their ability was not proven and not recognized, then they would never be able to get rid of this mark that represented childishness and weakness. If you still insist on not retreating, then bring it on, young man. The ascendant from the abyss raised his flame-shaped sword and solemnly declared, under the witness of this eye, you and I will fight. No one will interfere, and there will be no other outcome. We will not rest until one of us is dead. If you defeat me, it means that my trial has failed, and the Eye of Nightmare will no longer interfere in this matter. I'll go over, but unfortunately, the horse is being ridden by someone else. It's not convenient to use it. Huaisher shrugged indifferently and stepped forward step by step. He raised his voice and asked, how should I address you? What I mean is, I can at least set up a tombstone for you later. Richard, he said, Richard the Exiled. The Level 3 sublimator reported his name and revealed the aura that was bound in his body. The phantom of a griffin rose from behind him. At that moment, the iron boots shattered the concrete under his feet. The dueling shield shook and pushed forward with a loud bang. Like a war chariot, when the inhuman body under the armor began to exert force, a violent force burst out from it, pushing the heavy armor that weighed 100 kilograms forward with a loud bang. It stirred up a whistling hurricane. Huai Shi retreated step by step, pushed by the violent force on the shield. 2 cracks appeared in the broken concrete under his feet, and he felt the terrifying force contained in the short collision. His hand went numb. Against such an enemy, he should use the method he was best at to fight and exhaust him. With his speed, Richard would definitely not be able to catch up. But now, he could not escape. If he kept retreating, Richard, who had lost his patience, would attack Ai Qing directly. He could not retreat. Then, he would use the method of not retreating. He took a deep breath, and his face flushed red. Then, it instantly turned pale, and a trace of ashen color appeared. The hot sweat evaporated into mist, rising from his bare hands and face. Amidst the wisps of white, his muscles were trembling crazily. It was as if they had been burned red. Huai Shi let out a long sigh and exhaled the burning breath in his lungs. The flames of the mountain ghost rose from the crack in his chest, and enveloped his body once again. The advancement of the shield came to an abrupt stop. Before Huai Shi raised her hand and spread her fingers. Behind the armor, Richard raised his eyes in surprise and immediately came to a realization. Is this the move that was displayed in the rookie competition? An awe-inspiring skill. The flame-shaped sword slashed down with a whistling sound. As Huai Shi dodged, a deep crack appeared in the ground. Then, as Richard waved, the heavy longsword slapped on the shield. Sparks flew. It was like the sound of marching drums. You are indeed a strong opponent who can fight with me. Richard stared at Huai Shi in front of him with anticipation. Come, Your Highness! Victory or death! In the long howl of the griffin, its wings spread out, and a bright glow enveloped Richard's armor. The enemy stepped forward, attacking the burning mountain ghost. What responded to him was the saber and axe in Huai Shi's hands. The friction caused blazing sparks to burst out. It scattered toward the flame-shaped sword that was slashing down. The sharp sound of steel colliding burst out again. Huai Shi took a step back, but this time, he was not destroyed by the terrifying power. With the mountain ghost's sacred mark that could constantly repair the body and temporarily sacrifice the body to increase the power beyond the limit state, Huai Shi's muscle strength finally entered the third stage, the realm of ether. He could feel the violent power surging in his pulse like lava. The mountain ghost grinned, and the axe in his hand changed. He pulled out the sword of virtue and rushed forward. Again. Chapter 309. The mountain ghost suddenly lost its sense of reality. It was as if it had turned into rising smoke. When the mountain ghost collided with the griffin, its form became more and more ethereal. Even Huai Shi felt as if he was about to evaporate as the divine mark operated. It turned from a solid to a formless liquid, and then quickly turned into a drifting mist. Perhaps this was some kind of drawback or danger, but for some reason, he felt an indescribable joy in his heart. It was as if he had grown again. This was how it should be. This was how it should be. From one to many and then from many to one. In the end, it completely returned to nothingness. The boundless vitality within the origin substance began to gradually condense as it was drained away. The season slowly moved from midsummer to winter. After tossing aside the meaningless restlessness, it slowly began to plant its roots into the ground, waiting for spring to come. After being given life from death, the mountain ghost instinctively wanted to return to death. And now death was close at hand. The flame-shaped sword covered in frost slashed down, colliding with the lightning on the virtuous sword. Huai Shi took a step back, turned around, and deftly dispelled the terrifying power on the blade. As he spun, the blade of an axe appeared. As his hand swept across it, the lightning on the enchanted glove lit up the blade. Huai Shi raised his wrist and chopped down at the Griffin Knight's neck. Bang! The dueling shield suddenly shook, and deep cracks appeared on it. Lightning spread, bringing about an instant of paralysis. Huai Shi took another step forward, resisting the cold around Richard's body. The sacrificial knife appeared in his hand, and it pierced through the gaps in the armor. But then, as Richard roared, the sacrificial knife was suddenly clamped down and twisted. It broke. The impact of the origin substance breaking made Huaishi's vision go black. Then, he saw the flame-shaped sword in Richard's hand suddenly disintegrate. No, it should be said that under the power of his soul, it gathered into a beam of origin substance fire and slashed at his face. This was an ability that was similar to the sealing hand. After the flaming sword was transformed into origin substance, it was able to bind the origin substance within the outline of the blade, creating a violent, fleeting attack. After expending a weapon, he would instantly gain 10 times more power than before. Chop! Huaishi hurriedly retreated, using the Emperor Yu's steps. He felt as if his tendons were about to be torn apart. A sharp gash appeared on the front of his gray windbreaker, and the origin substance within it had been deeply dented. The hallucinatory pain had already been engraved into his heart. If it wasn't for this light armor, Huaishi would have been severely injured in an instant. But when Huaishi retreated to the limit and almost couldn't feel his feet anymore, the power he had accumulated suddenly erupted. It was like the rebound of a spring that had been compressed to the limit. Huaishi ignored the embers of the origin substance sword and leapt forward. The spear of compassion suddenly appeared in his pale green hands and pierced forward. A mournful shriek rang out. Richard didn't panic, as if he had expected this. After the dueling shield, he pulled out a heavy longsword and blocked in front of him. In the next instant, the long spear pierced through. With one strike, it actually broke through his well-trained defensive stance. He had to retreat. He instinctively raised his heavy shield, wanting to react, but he didn't expect. Huaishi was already right in front of him. The long spear in his hand had at some point transformed into an axe covered in electric light. It was aimed at his neck and suddenly chopped down. 2 mournful cries overlapped, forming a perfect chord. The faceplate cracked. Countless steel fragments flew out, and the third note rang out from the spine of the sword of virtue. Richard subconsciously opened his eyes wide. He saw the expressionless youth raise the blade, as if time had frozen, inch by inch, piercing through the cracks in the armor. Wedged into the neck, swung horizontally, and so the headless knight fell backwards. Only a head flew into the air, blood splattering everywhere. Dead. Death came suddenly, but the flagship of the Eye of Nightmare in the sky did not react. It quietly watched the outcome of the battle, witnessing the immature receive death. The battle ended. At that moment, the figure hidden in the void suddenly leaped out. The assassin, who had been lurking for a long time, crossed hundreds of feet in one step. That instant of explosive power was even above Huaishi's step. He stabbed the dark green dagger in his hand at Huaishi's back. It pierced through Huaishi's chest and protruded from his chest. A stream of sticky poisonous blood dripped down. Huaishi raised his hand expressionlessly and threw the invisible axe behind him. In his shadow, the ghost jumped out and grabbed the axe blade that was spinning in the air. It slashed at the assassin behind Huaishi. Cut at the waist. The screaming body fell to the ground and was cut into 2 tragic halves. Huaishi reached out and pulled out half of the dagger. He left the other half, which was soaked in poison, at his back. He took the axe blade from the red gloves and stepped on the assassin's chest. "Goodbye," he whispered to the back of the knife, and the axe blade fell. The scream stopped abruptly. The indifferent youth raised his head and looked into the distance. On the distant railway, on the roof of the speeding train, the sniper, who had been crawling on the ground for a long time, looked away from the scope as if he had been electrocuted. He was intimidated by the almost tangible darkness in his eyes. The fleeting opportunity had slipped away from his hands just like that. He didn't dare to look anymore. He immediately threw the sniper rifle into the river beside him and crawled back into the carriage. He returned to his position and became an unrelated tourist again. Huai retracted his gaze and waited for a while. After no one came to challenge him again, he turned around and walked towards the white horse. He saw a corpse that had been kicked to pieces beside the white horse. Who is this? I don't know. Ai Qing shook her head. He's probably here to take advantage of the situation. Huai nodded and pulled out the remaining half of the dagger. He threw it on the ground and applied a layer of silver blood potion on it. He looked up and asked, "How far is it?" 80 kilometers. It's not far. Ai Qing asked, "Are we still going?" "Then let's go." Huai got on the horse and looked at the gradually gloomy sky in front of him. In the darkness, there were faint flashes of lightning and thunder, illuminating the young man's pitch-black eyes. However, the darkness was empty, reflecting the fleeting lightning and emitting a faint metallic glow. He said, "Let's continue." So they continued. They walked down the highway and went forward. They saw the canyon between the mountains and the bridge above the canyon. A stooped figure stood on the bridge, emitting a foul smell. But in his hands, he held a large scythe that looked exaggerated compared to his monkey-like body. The bone-white scythe was full of gaps, making people feel cold just by looking at it. And under the disheveled hair, a pair of eyes that were less black than white burned red the moment he saw them. After a strange cry, he pounced straight at them. Both of his legs were actually reversed joints. Rather than a person, it was better to say that he was like a beast. Bang! The sweeping scythe blade stopped abruptly in front of Huai. On the white horse, the sword of virtue was pressed against the handle of the scythe. Huai slowly raised his eyes and stared at his blood-red eyes. "Just you?" The monkey-like strange person did not speak. He still screamed, raised the scythe in his hand and slashed again. But the white horse stood up like a human and abruptly kicked at him with its hooves. The enemy flew out, but before he landed, Huai had already appeared in front of him. The blade slashed down and an arm flew up. In the spurt of blood, another arm popped out of the wound and suddenly grabbed Huai's face, gouging out 2 bloody marks. The scythe wielder's legs fell to the ground. The scythe swept across, and the sharp sound of steel rubbing against each other sounded. Lightning flashed, and the blade of the axe chopped down. The bone-white scythe broke. The strange person opened his mouth to scream, but saw Huai coming forward. The sacrificial knife in his hand nailed into his mouth, sucking his blood crazily. In an instant, the dirty face withered. The next moment, the blade of the axe was raised and chopped down. The head flew out. The enemy fell to the ground. Worried about the terrifying regenerative ability, Huai waved his hand, threw down a pack of metal fuel, and snapped his fingers. Flames rose into the sky. In the raging fire, the monkey-like strange person struggled crazily, screaming, and in the end was completely burned to ashes. All that was left was a withered head, its eyes wide open as it stared fixedly at Huai. Huai raised the axe and chopped it. Dead. He raised his hand, wiped the wounds on his face with the silver blood potion, and looked into the distance. 70 kilometers. He turned around and led the white horse. "Let's go." "Okay." Ai Qing nodded. They continued to move forward. On a distant mountain, 2 people in black suits stared at everything here with binoculars. When they saw that the monster they sent out was killed so easily, they could not help but frown. Not fast enough? The speed is enough, but the skill is not good enough. There are too many beasts integrated. There's still one backup. Do you want to continue? The actual combat practice is to find flaws. Once the flaws are found, there's no need to get involved. Then let's go. Okay. They picked up the briefcase beside them and turned to leave. Huai was still moving forward. 52 kilometers away, outside Mingguang town, he saw a huge beast crawling at the foot of the mountain. It had 8 arthropods like a spider, and its whole body was covered with heavy steel armor. Venom slowly dripped from its mouth. The violent chemical toxin melted the stones into liquid, and a pungent stench spread. On its back, a woman with dense tattoos on her skin raised her eyes, holding a hook-like spear and a dagger in her hands. Seeing the arrival of Huai Shi and the others, she slowly raised the weapons in her hand. "I've cleaned up the surroundings. Don't worry about your woman," she said in choppy Dongsha language. "Bring it on. Although she's not anyone's woman, thank you anyway." Huai Shi smiled and threw the sacrificial knife to the red gloves, asking him to guard Ai Qing. After standing a little further away, he raised the spear of compassion in his hand and clenched it. Without warning, a large dark green net was spat out from the spider-like beast's mouth. Its sharp knife feet trampled on the ground, whistling toward Huai Shi. The spear of compassion was raised. From the fragrance of iris flowers, a dim electric light lit up, reflecting the sudden burst of thunder in the sky above his head. It stabbed forward. The white horse neighed, moved forward, and walked into the net. Then, with a fierce piercing, the entire net and restraint were torn apart, and the horse brazenly crashed into the spider-like beast. The long hook and the spear of compassion collided in the air, creating sparks. At the moment of intersection, the woman swung the dagger in her hand horizontally. It was as fast as lightning. Huai Shi couldn't stop it in time. He didn't want to stop it. In his hand, the axe blade slashed down again, smashing the spider-like beast's helmet with irresistible force. Its head was smashed into pieces. The dagger slashed across his throat, tearing apart the collar of his windbreaker, leaving behind a wound so deep that the bone could be seen. But then, the crack healed as Huai Shi's palm wiped it, forcibly reconnecting it. At the moment when the mount was hacked to death, the rider couldn't help but stagger. Then, she saw Huai Shi's sword of virtue pierce through her on the saddle. Her lungs were torn apart. The woman with tattoos all over her face seemed to feel no pain. The long hook in her hand suddenly softened, entangling Huai Shi like a snake, and the dagger in her other hand stabbed again. Bang! The axe of fury swept across, shattering the softened long hook. With irresistible force, it cut the dagger into pieces along with her arm. Then, he raised his arm, and the blade of the axe drew an arc and chopped down. Cut! The two sides crossed each other, and blood spurted out. From Huai Shi's chest to the rider's shoulder. The white horse ran forward for a while, then turned back to look at Huai Shi. Huai Shi patted its neck, and it snorted, then trotted back to where she had come from. Ai Qing raised her head and stared at the deep wound on Huai Shi's chest. Her expression didn't change, and she just asked, "Continue?" "Continue." Huai Shi answered calmly, reached out, and pulled her onto the horse's back. They continued forward. In the increasingly dense thunder, the distant sky gradually darkened. It was going to rain. 50 kilometers to go. Chapter 310. Triple Suspect, You're Under Arrest. In the solemn atmosphere of the conference room, the young man on the big screen who was dancing with a trident took the lead and raised his spear. Suddenly, he burst out from the crowd and his spear shot out like a dragon, piercing a middle-aged man with glasses to the ground. Without waiting for the commotion to spread, 4 or 5 ascendants who had been waiting for a long time pounced forward and put on shackles and shackles. Then, they hammered a silver nail to the neck and pinned this notorious wanted criminal to the ground, skillfully and deftly capturing him alive. Immediately after, someone clapped his hands before the crowd could react, smiled, and used a wide-area hypnosis and suggestion, asking everyone to pretend that nothing had happened. Very quickly, the triple suspect was stuffed into a van headed directly to Jixia and disappeared from the screen. On the various screens on the big screen, more than 6 teams were moving at top speed, continuously capturing or killing the sublimators who had snuck into the reality according to the plan. As the eldest cousin tapped his fingers on the table, the countdown continued, like a symphony. Dozens of tense and chaotic arrests were carried out in an orderly manner within a quarter of an hour, then arrested one criminal after another without any mistakes. Team B can start moving now. He turned around and said to his assistant, Let Team D wait for a while. Rank 4 is a bit tricky. Call Kwafu, we'll send out the long bow guards. The Knight of Doom and the Blade of Annihilation rarely dare to show themselves in the reality. Don't let them think that they're here for a vacation. Doom, who was already used to the assistant's work, nodded. He was about to say something when he saw Zhu Hongchen's expression become serious, as if he was thinking. Outside the meeting room, hurried footsteps could be heard. Immediately after, someone pushed open the door and entered. Sorry, there was a bit of traffic on the way. The Mouth of Hunger 3-star milk tea you ordered has arrived. Please sign here and give us a good review later. Thank you. The mysterious delivery man from yesterday's delivery service stuck his arm out from behind the door, a string of milk tea takeout bags hanging from his arm. Zhu Hongchen immediately beamed with joy. Well said, well said. There's a barbecue later, please hurry up. After sending the delivery man away, Big Cousin skillfully distributed the milk tea to everyone's speechless expression. As he sipped his abyss milk tea with double sugar and pearls, he looked up at the arrest list displayed on the screen and sighed. 1-2-17. Aya, how many third-class merits are there? There are even 2 second-class merits. This is great, this is great. He thought for a moment and came up with a bold idea. Why don't I apply for a few 100 million yuan in foreign exchange next time, and we can just put a bounty on anyone? Mo-san had long been accustomed to his bureau chief's crazy ideas every now and then. He skillfully asked, if Xian Niao knew that you were fishing for law enforcement, wouldn't you get beaten up? Just pretend I didn't say anything. Eldest cousin sighed helplessly and threw himself back into the swivel chair. After spinning around a few times, he finally remembered. Where's Huaishe? Where are you now? Border. Stone City is 35 kilometers away. Mo-san glanced at his phone and sighed softly. He probably wants to take AI Ching from there? From Stone City, as long as he passes through 2 shallow layers of hell, he can ride the endless sea to Myanmar. 35. Zhu Hongchen was silent for a long time, as if he was shocked by the distance. He slowly shook his head. It must be very difficult to get here, right? It's never been easy from the beginning. It doesn't seem like something a second-class person could do. No, most third-class ascendants wouldn't be able to accomplish such a feat, right? Very quickly, the information from the observers was transmitted to the large screen. A string of blood-red and pitch-black names continuously appeared, piercing everyone's eyes. Broken Bone Killer and Long, Red East Wind Valley, Butterfly, Orlando Landers. Exiled Richard, Reflection, a Scythe Ape Ghoul, a Spider Walker Angelica, Air Northbound, a Singer Sue Sang. These people came from different places, different countries, different genealogies, and different borders. The only thing they had in common was the black line that represented death above their names at this moment. Behind their names, where the cause of death was, there were only 2 words that hadn't changed. Beheading. Beheading, 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 beheading. These fugitives, or even famous border hunters, each of their deeds and memories were enough to be recorded into a sensational novel. But now there were no more novels. Only names were written on this callous list. One by one, they were beheaded. Furthermore, the list was constantly being refreshed, with new names constantly floating up from below. As more and more people died, the list grew longer and longer. And Huaishe was still moving forward. Still 20 kilometers away, Mo-san's eyes widened in disbelief. What's wrong? His eldest cousin looked over with a half-smile. Were you scared? I'm just a little surprised. Mo-san fell silent for a long time, then shook his head and sighed. I didn't expect this at all, even though there was irrefutable evidence and countless people had witnessed it. Mo-san still found it very difficult to connect such a terrifying and bloody battle record to that seemingly thin and gentle youth. It's not that people didn't expect many things, they just didn't want them to happen. Zhu Hongqian poked at the pearls in his milk tea with a straw and suddenly asked, "Do you know what a stress reaction is?" Mo-san turned around but didn't say anything. "It's like when soldiers go to war and come home crying when they wake up from a nightmare. When normal people are frightened, they will stumble backwards and scream. If you use a small hammer to hit someone's knee, it will either bounce back or be smashed to pieces. This is a natural instinct. Teacher Luo told me that this is Huai Shi's innate talent." He raised his head and stared at the name list on the large screen as he said calmly, "When he wields a sword, he is no longer the youth you know. When he has nowhere else to go, he won't smile like he did in the past. He knows what he's doing and what he's going to do, but he won't regret it. Then, he will become ferocious, like iron, like the charcoal burning in the furnace and the long winter of hunger and cold, destroying everything of value." As such, Zhu Hongqian narrowed his eyes and made a decisive judgment. If AI Qing can't survive, he definitely won't retreat. Mo-san didn't say anything else. Zhu Hongqian didn't say anything either. Names continued to appear on the name list, the crimson and the pitch black, as if they had formed a path of blood and bone. They slowly advanced. Still 10 kilometers away, another soul-shaking explosion came from the distance, and the screams came to an abrupt halt. Only the sound of hooves could be heard. It echoed the sound of thunder in the distance. All of the bounty hunters gathered at the entrance of the stone city looked at each other uneasily. They were no longer as calm and relaxed as they had been a while ago. Fear gradually invaded their hearts as the sound of hooves approached. He was advancing. The last 15 bounty hunters who had rushed to Jinling were here. They had arrived too late and didn't even have time to stop him. In the end, they discovered that the people who had rushed to the front were already dead. The people who had ascended couldn't be considered weak. They just hadn't been able to make it in time. But no matter who it was, when they heard about the terrifying achievements that had been made in the past 3 hours, they couldn't help but feel an indescribable sense of disgust. Especially when they might become a part of those achievements. When they looked at each other, the wariness and hostility in their eyes disappeared. Instead, they could clearly see the panic and unease in many people's eyes. Some people had already turned around and left, but even more people chose to stay. "Don't be afraid, he's just one person, we'll all attack together, no matter how strong he is. Does he have 3 heads and 6 arms?" These words circled around everyone's lips, but no one said them out loud. Once they said it out loud, the battle would probably be over before it even started. "Let's establish a position first and wait," the ascendant with slightly gray hair suggested. "This time, it's obvious that we can't handle it alone. Why don't we work together? If you trust me, then we'll split the money according to our contributions. I'll send the dead people's share to their magic gold bank account. Those who agree, come to my side." At this time, whether it was a good decision or a bad decision, it was precious. There was nothing more irritating than silence and hesitation. It couldn't be better if someone stood up and was willing to take responsibility. Soon, 3 slightly sparse lines of defense were set up at the entrance of the stone city. This section of the ancient city wall was built with the back of the Black Lake in the distance. They waited for the sound of horse hooves to approach, until a blood-stained knight riding a scarlet warhorse slowly walked out of the abandoned train tunnel. In the dead silence, the knight on the horse's back, who was almost dyed red, was revealed in front of everyone. He was already covered in bruises. His face was covered in blood, and he no longer looked as handsome and feminine as the information said. There was only a heart-palpitating calmness. Viscous blood dripped from the gorgeous and cold spear blade, falling into the soil. Wherever it passed, clusters of pure white irises bloomed. The heavily injured white horse neighed and slowly moved forward with the silent knight on its back. It was as if it would fall dead on the spot at any time. It was hard to believe that people could still be alive at this level, but in fact there were still blazing breaths coming out of their mouths and noses. Their bloodshot eyes carried the temperature of hell's lava. Even though it was so tragic, the girl behind the knight was spotless and didn't suffer any injuries. Because no one could pass in front of him. The scarlet white horse raised its eyes and stared coldly at the enemies in front of it, slowly moving forward. The knight was still silent. The distance slowly closed, and everyone saw the wounds and blood on Huaishi's body. In the silence, their expressions twitched and they exchanged glances with each other. Until the commander with gray hair slowly stood up, put out the cigarette at the corner of his mouth, and sighed softly. He stood up and shouted at the knight. "Huaishi, is it?" No one answered. In the silence, the white horse still moved forward, neither fast nor slow. Its cracked iron hooves hit the stone, bursting into sparks. Like the beating of a drum, it shook everyone's heart. "There's no need for this," the commander said loudly. "No one can blame you anymore after you've done this. Even if you die, you can't rush over. Why don't we talk?" Still, no one spoke. Huaishi lowered his eyes and didn't respond, as if he didn't hear it. But then, the sound of iron hooves trampling became denser. The horse's hooves hit the rusty iron track, reflecting the thunder that suddenly crossed the sky. Lightning lashed down from the dark clouds and disappeared in a flash, illuminating the pair of pitch-black eyes. It was cold and indifferent like cast iron. The white horse galloped forward, letting out a furious neigh. Huaishi roared. The hoarse roar of the mountain ghost suddenly burst out, followed by the sound of thunder. On the galloping white horse, the spear of compassion was raised and aimed at the old and stunned face. There was a roar of gunfire, but in an instant, the insignificant bullets were shaken off by the white horse. Huaishi was moving forward. The last kilometer. Chapter 3:11. At that moment, the blood-stained white horse rushed into the frontmost defensive position. The long spear pierced straight through, tearing the frontmost face, and piercing through the outermost defensive line like a hot knife through butter. The alchemy bomb that fell from the horse's back immediately buried everything in the sweeping fire and roar. Huaishi was still moving forward. The white horse leaped over the trenches and sharp iron spikes on the ground. The iron hooves trampled, and blood spurted out. Huaishi, who was on the horse, swept the blade of the spear and casually chopped the axe to the left. Blood and bones shattered. In the tragic sound, a corpse fell on its back and blood splashed. Then, more deaths suddenly came. Chaotic roars and screams sounded, but then, they were annihilated under the cruel ravages. The iron hooves trampled, and the white horse moved forward step by step, breaking through the second line of defense. The old commander didn't even have time to react. The blood-stained knight had already rushed over, and the axe wrapped in electric light swept across, smashing the barrier of nothingness with irresistible force. The white horse stood up on its hind legs and crushed his weapon. It neighed loudly and set off a bloody storm that had arrived late. A pitch-black shotgun was raised from the horse's back, and it was aimed at the commander's face. "Talk!" At the last moment, he heard a hoarse sneer from the horse's back. "Do you deserve to talk?" The trigger was pulled. The gushing metal rain brought death and darkness, indicating the beginning of the final battle. And there was no more obstruction in front of him. Huaishi looked back, and his blood-stained eyes quietly stared at the pursuers behind him, who didn't have time to disperse. Once again, he raised the blade of the spear in his hand. With the final thunder, the torrential rain fell from the sky, swallowing the last screams and wails. After a long, long time, when Huaishi numbly pulled out the blade of the spear from the corpse, he looked around and couldn't see anyone else. There were no more enemies here. He gasped with relief. He felt the white horse stagger and kneel in the mud on the ground. Its head, which was covered in wounds and blood, slowly turned to look at him for the last time. After pushing his shoulder, it turned into a phantom and dissipated. In the torrential rain, Huaishi got up from the ground, stretched out his hand, and supported Ai Qing. They slowly walked to the broken city gate in front of them. After passing through the broken city wall and the broken city gate, they would be able to enter the border, Stone City. But Ai Qing's footsteps came to an abrupt halt. She stopped in place. Huaishe looked back blankly and saw her calm eyes. Once you enter the border, you will be considered a traitor. Do you understand? Ai Qing said. Tian will not allow such a degree of dereliction of duty and rebellion. Huaishe did not answer. He knew. Ai Qing thought and asked, "What do you plan to do after going to the border? Will anyone accept me? There will only be more people waiting inside. Maybe Inya is there waiting for us to come to him. Are you sure you can beat him?" Huaishe did not answer. He did not know. Ai Qing stared at him silently. After a long time, she asked the last question. "Do you think I didn't think of what you would do after coming to the Yin family and encountering such a thing?" Huaishe did not answer. He did not know if he knew. "I'm using you, Huaishe." Ai Qing asked, "Is it really necessary to do this for this kind of woman? You know I won't leave it alone, right?" Huaishe smiled and replied in a calm tone that made her extremely unhappy. "Knowing how to rely on friends is a sign of your growth, isn't it? There's no need to care about other things." Speaking of making use of others, hadn't he made use of Ai Qing and the Astronomy Association more often than not? They were friends when they were young, but it was said that there were only pros and cons in the adult world. It was not bad to be good friends who could use each other. Why did he have to be so stubborn? He grabbed Ai Qing's hand and continued to move forward. He heard the girl's doubtful voice behind him. "Huaishe, don't tell me you're in love?" Huaishe turned around and was stunned for a long time. He was amused by her serious tone and could not help but shake his head. "Don't be ridiculous. Who would fall in love with a woman like you?" "Yes, then I'm relieved." Ai Qing sighed softly. "But even if I don't care, I still can't help but feel angry when people say that." As she spoke, she reached out and pressed Huaishe's neck. A small amount of anger and unhappiness exploded on her fingertips. There was a soft slap. The last straw fell. The exhausted camel was finally overwhelmed. Huaishe fell on his back, but soon, he was supported by Ai Qing. She supported Huaishe forward and walked to a place under the city gate where the rain could not reach. She put him down and leaned against the wall. "Don't you understand, Huaishe?" Ai Qing looked at his stunned expression, shook her head and sighed. "Now I'm your last stumbling block." No one needed Huaishe to take revenge anymore. But as long as she was still around, Huaishe would always be entangled with the hatred of the past and the Yin family. Only when Ai Qing was gone could he be completely free to live the life he wanted. "There's no need to be so surprised, right?" She suddenly laughed. "If there's anything you taught me, it's that I have to do my own things. Now it seems that I'm doing well. Why do you continue to interfere?" Huaishe was stunned. It was the first time he saw Ai Qing's smile. It was calm and warm, no longer gloomy, but with the taste of sunshine. She was already free. After he finished speaking, he thought for a while and added, "You know, for example, a parting word, a suggestion, or a farewell and regret. If you want to apologize, it's not too late." "Apologize? Are you dreaming?" Ai Qing coldly extinguished his fantasy. After thinking for a while, she said seriously, "If there's really any advice, it's to learn to be more ruthless. Don't be a good person, but don't be too bad either." She said, "Don't become like me." Seeing Huaishe's stunned look, she shook her head and laughed. "From 9 years ago until today, I've been thinking about how to get more power and status, how to find other people's weaknesses, how to take revenge on those who suppressed me. Should this kind of life be described as bleak or fulfilling? I don't understand at all. But there's only one thing I can be sure of," Ai Qing said seriously. "The past few hours have been the most free time of my life." She lowered her head and stared into the young man's eyes. She said solemnly, "Thank you, Huaishe." Huaishe was stunned for a long time. He coughed dryly and couldn't help but look away. If you really want to thank me, can you stay and be my slave to repay me? Stop dreaming, why sure. In stories, isn't that usually a matter of the next life? She took a step back, as if she was preparing to leave after work, and told him calmly. Goodbye, why sure. She turned and walked into the rain. Step by step, she walked into the rain. When she saw the sneaky shadows that lingered behind the curtain of rain and didn't dare to approach, she showed her trademark mocking smile, and looked away with disdain. She stood still in the lonely rain. I surrender myself here. Ai Ching raised her head and said to the empty sky, except for the dark clouds, everything Huai Shi does is under my orders and commands. He's just fulfilling his duty. At that moment the rain stopped abruptly. It was as if the world had frozen at that moment. Countless raindrops that fell hastily hung in the air, illuminated by the sudden appearance of a fierce light in the void. Dazzling lights burst out from the void, piercing through the rain and enveloping Ai Ching's body. It was as if countless suns had risen in an instant in the rain and fog. Under the illumination of countless suns, the shadow of a huge building silently slid out of the void and stood on this desolate and muddy land. In the blink of an eye, even the mud had dried up, turning into a firm and neat grassland. And on top of the gray wall, in the midst of countless dazzling lights, the symbol of the Astronomy Society hung solemnly, overlooking the sinners who had reined in their horses at the edge of the cliff. The cold aura spread in all directions, intimidating all the fanatics who dared to have evil intentions. It issued a stern warning without any mercy. Either don't move, or die. Thus, no one dared to step forward. Only two black-clothed men wearing sunglasses came forward, as if they had been waiting for a long time. They looked at Ai Ching, then looked up at Huai Shi, who had fallen under the city gate, and softly asked a few questions. After Ai Ching answered, they nodded, took out handcuffs, and handcuffed Ai Ching's wrists. Madam Ai Ching, the Ministry of Justice has evaluated and reviewed the laws you have violated. You will be temporarily detained, and your trial will be held in a week. After showing her the document with the seal of the Astronomy Society and the signature of the Ministry of Justice, the leading black-clothed man asked, Do you have anything else to say? No, I believe the Astronomy Society will give me a fair judgment. Ai Ching calmly shook her head, then said, But before that, can you give me a blanket? I'm a little cold. Soon, a thin and warm blanket appeared in the hands of the female black-clothed man and covered Ai Ching's shoulders. Is this okay? She asked. Ai Ching nodded, turned around, and followed them to the door that suddenly opened without any resistance. Finally, she heard a shout behind her. Wait a minute. At some point, Huai Shi had crawled up from the ground. He used the sword of virtue to support his body and shouted at Ai Ching with all his might, Wait a minute, Ai Ching. Panting heavily, Huai Shi stared at her back and said with all his strength, One more question. I have one more question to ask you. There was one more question that he had to ask. He was afraid that if he didn't ask now, he wouldn't have a chance in the future. But when Ai Ching turned around, he fell into silence. His lips moved, but he couldn't speak. The two black-clothed men didn't seem to be in a hurry. They were tolerant of this kind of thing. Or rather, after witnessing everything from the beginning to the end, they looked at Huai Shi with eyes full of admiration and sympathy. It was just a few minutes they could afford to wait. Ai Ching calmly looked at Huai Shi's red face. She was waiting for his question. She seemed to have prepared the cruelest answer. Huai Shi hesitated for a long time. He finally mustered up his courage and asked loudly, Where did you buy the divine light of grace? In the dead silence, Ai Ching was stunned. The words that she was about to blurt out were stuck in her throat. After a long time, she finally reacted. Her shoulders couldn't help but shake, and she chuckled. It was not only self-deprecating but also helpless. She should be angry, but for some reason, there was an indescribable helplessness. I really do hate you, Huai Shi, She took one last look at Huaishur, turned around, and disappeared into the darkness behind the door. I hate you the most in the world. The door closed behind her with a loud bang. The dazzling sun and the emblem of the Astronomical Association disappeared together with the huge and cold building. Only the gradually exhausted rain dripped weakly from the sky. Huaishur staggered back and leaned against the wet wall. What? He chuckled softly and shook his head. You don't even want to send me a link? Isn't it too cold? No one answered. Through the thin curtain of rain and gradually dissipating dark clouds, he saw the distant sun gradually sink into the curtain of night. In the clear dusk, fleeting starlight lit up in the dusky sky. The rain was about to stop. He closed his eyes tiredly. Then, he felt the rain on his face stop abruptly. There was a black umbrella over his head. A passing cowherd looked down at his helpless and embarrassed appearance and laughed gloatingly. Yo, young man, are you heartbroken? Huaishur rolled his eyes at him, thought for a while, and suddenly asked. Are you free? He said. Let's go for a drink. It's my treat. Okay. Yu Dongri smiled and reached out to pull him up from the ground. Let's go. But have you thought of a toast? To death, how about that? Not bad, anything else? To freedom. Huaishur took one last look at the direction where Ai Qing left, chuckled softly, and walked forward. He said, I'm free. Chapter 312. When she woke up, she saw a white ceiling. The smell of disinfectant echoed with the monotonous ticking of the instrument. Luo Xian raised her eyes in confusion and heard hurried footsteps outside the door. The awakened doctors pushed the door in and gave her a comprehensive examination. They didn't miss anything. Then, they were puzzled to find that the originally weakened soul seemed to have been reborn from a cocoon, but it wasn't damaged or better than before. There was no change. Nothing more, nothing less. Although they couldn't find any reason to explain this situation, there was no way to dissect or do any in-depth research. Some people wanted to give it a try under the ban, but after being glanced at by the old man who was leaning against the wall, they obediently gave up on this bold idea. In the end, they could only leave with the conclusion that everything was normal. Only the father and daughter were left in the ward. Elder Luo blew a breath and closed the door. Finally, he looked at his daughter who had woken up. He looked at her carefully for a long time and shook his head in confusion. It feels like nothing has changed. Yeah, it seems to be the same as before. Luo Xian looked down at her hands. She didn't seem to care about everything that happened to her. It was just difficult to understand. The characteristics of the abyss still remained in her, but the human part didn't decline at all. She wasn't reborn as a human, but she didn't die as a monster either. The two sides mixed together again in an unpleasant way. But this time, there were no benefits like before. After losing the strengths of both sides, all the flaws of both sides were retained. Without the brutality and cruelty of the abyss, she was given the weakness and limitations of a human. Was this a success or a failure? No matter how she rejected the past and how much effort and determination she put into it, at best, it just changed the position of the two sides on the scale. She didn't fall into the abyss, nor did she return to the human side. Instead, she wandered between the two sides. She looked completely different from the past, but her essence didn't change at all. This kind of appearance really made people feel helpless and unbearable from the bottom of their hearts. How funny, Xiaoxian. The old man shook his head and saw through the failure of this effort at a glance. This is your essence. It can't be changed, even if you are given love. He made a decisive judgment without any warmth. He was already well aware of the outcome of this farce. There were some things in this world that couldn't be changed with hard work alone, no matter how strong one's will or desire was. The physical world never relied on origin substances, and if you tried to use origin substances to interfere, you would have to be prepared for the situation to worsen. The more you want to get, the more the world will give you, but what you get may not be the result you want. In the end, other than emptiness and disillusionment, there was nothing left. That was how hell was created. Regardless of the literal meaning of hell, it was all the same. Did you find anything, Xiaoxian? I don't think so. Luo Xian tilted her head and thought for a while. Then, she laughed self-deprecatingly. I seem to have lost a little more. I always feel that the losses outweigh the gains. After losing his original ferocity and predator nature, he was given a weak sense of compassion, but the hunger and inadequacy in his heart had never been satisfied. She was still incomplete. The old man nodded, not minding it at all. He just bent down and squeezed his overly sturdy body into the small sofa. He crossed his legs and asked, So, did you learn anything? If you want to say it, I don't think so. Luo Xian shook her head and sighed regretfully. I was given a sense of compassion, but the desire to kill something in my heart became even stronger. Is this what you meant by getting worse, father? After experiencing what love is, not only was I not satisfied, but I also yearned for that kind of thing even more. Happiness was obtained through death, love was obtained through killing. No matter what, there was no way to make up for this natural flaw. The temporary satisfaction caused the monster side to temporarily retreat, but the desire for something that had once been obtained was thousands of times stronger than before. It would only become crazier. It's okay. Don't you still have father? Elder Luo slowly got up and reached out to her. Let's go home. No, father. Luo Xian thought for a while, shook her head, and said seriously, I already have someone I want to kill. Is that so? Yes. Luo Xian smiled. Until now, a trace of rosy appeared on her pale cheeks, and her dark eyes were filled with joy, expectation, and love. What kind of person is he? The old man scratched his head in confusion. Can you introduce him to father? Father, haven't you already met him? Luo Xian thought for a while and recalled the past memory. He's not like you, father, who could be indifferent to what I did. He's also not like the other worldlings in the abyss, who praised what I did. He's also not like the others who were afraid of my food and avoided me. After seeing my food, he actually wanted to taste it. Speaking of the scene at that time, she couldn't help but smile. Although he spat it out after just one bite and cried uncontrollably, he really didn't die. At that time I suddenly thought, this is probably the arrangement of God, right? When I was at my loneliest, a person I wanted to kill was sent to me, and a person I couldn't kill became my friend, constantly reminding me of the ugliness and distortion. I don't know how to describe such feelings, but I want to kill him. Luo Xian looked at her father and told him seriously, or, it's the same if he kills me. In the long silence, the old man looked at his daughter and raised his eyebrows in astonishment. He didn't know if it was pity or pity, but he couldn't help but shake his head. The first love in more than 20 years is actually one-sided? What a pity, Xiaoxian. The old man sighed softly. Whether it's killing or being killed, loving or being loved, I'm afraid you won't get it. That's enough, isn't it? Luo Xian still looked at him and calmly accepted this reality. Didn't the book say that first love is always restrained and inexperienced? It's just that you can't get the result, it's not to the extent that it's depressing, right? The old man thought for a while and nodded. That's true. He asked, So, are you planning to leave home? Did you see through it? A father has to understand his daughter, right? The old man asked, Where do you plan to go? Rome? America? The Russian Federation? London? Or outside of the present world? I haven't thought about it yet. Luo Xian thought for a while and shook her head. I'll go out and walk around. Since I was born, I haven't been out of Jinling much. In this case, father will have a lot less worries, right? Will you come back? I'll naturally come and take a look when I pass by. Luo Xian said, Although it's a pity that I didn't kill you, I also hope that you can live a long life and not die in the hands of others. I'll try my best. The old man nodded indifferently. He looked at his daughter in front of him and felt that she was a little strange. It's really hard to understand. Did she grow up unknowingly? Or was it the magic of love that made people grow up? But in any case, it was time for her to face the world alone. It was like watching a fledgling who spread its wings to challenge the authority of the elders. Under the harsh and strict scrutiny, his eyes became gratified and helpless. The greedy evil spirit actually yearns for restrained love. How ridiculous, Xiaoxian. Do you have such a dream? People always have dreams, right? Luo Xian replied hopefully. Maybe, one day, people like me can also be redeemed. Yes, maybe. The old man nodded and gently stroked the girl's long hair with his rough big hand, full of kindness. I hope you can enjoy this dream, Xiaoxian. If one day you find that you've woken up from your dream, come back. I'll be here waiting for you. He said, then, I'll kill you. He would kill the monster he created with his own hands and bring the final relief to his daughter, who had completely despaired of the world. Okay. Luo Xian nodded, feeling the last tenderness of the old man. This was the final agreement between father and daughter. When Huaishe woke up in the same hospital, it was already a week later. He only remembered that he dragged his heavy injuries to Yu Dongri and drank a lot. After that, he fainted and fell to the ground. He woke up once in the middle, and seemed to be on the operating table. In his dizziness, he heard the chief surgeon's disbelieving sigh. When he closed his eyes and opened them again, he was already lying on the hospital bed. He looked at the familiar ceiling and smacked his lips, feeling that something was wrong. After a deep sleep and recovery, those injuries had already healed, but Huaishe still couldn't get up. It was the after-effects of using too much origin substance. Before the crack in his soul healed, he would probably have a nervous breakdown and insomnia for a long time. When he picked up his phone, he saw Yu Dongri's message. He saw that Huaishe didn't know when he would wake up, so he happily paid for a month's medical expenses and went to Shambhala alone for his so-called hot spring recuperation and hunting trip. Huaishe was extremely envious when she saw the photos of him with various young ladies in his circle of friends, as well as the huge humanoid robot that loomed in the background. If he had known earlier, he would have been more shameless and followed him. It would have been good to touch the robot. When he opened the internal app of the Astronomical Society, he saw a notice sent to him by the legal department. The secret trial of AI Qing had already started yesterday. Thanks to her excellent defense and AI Qing's own ability and value, or perhaps because of some political transaction and protection that Huaishe didn't understand, in the end, because she took the initiative to surrender, she was only sentenced to 20 years of border service, which was to be executed immediately. Unfortunately, the place she was in charge of was a confidential organization and unit. Huaishe didn't even know where she was going or how to contact her. When he called the original phone, he only received a voice notification that the phone was turned off. She seemed to have suddenly disappeared from the world that Huaishe could touch, like a phantom evaporating in the fog, leaving without a sound. Huaishe didn't feel anything at all. And another thing was that for some reason, due to the recognition of Huaishe's own talent and various reasons, he was promoted from a temporary action member to an official military officer in the Astronomical Society. Other than receiving partial legal immunity and the identity of an official member, under the recognition of the Dongxia genealogy, he replaced AI Qing's original position and became the new inspector of Xinhai after 2 weeks. He would be able to receive the authority and information from the headquarters and become the representative of the Astronomical Society in Xinhai. Originally, the inspector needed to go through training and assessment at the border of London before being officially appointed, but for some reason, when it was Huaishe's turn, they were so perfunctory and careless, only sending an electronic notice and file verification. How did he improve like this? What is going on? Huaishe sighed in confusion. After messing around, Not only was he not removed from his position, he was even promoted? What were those people from the Central Management Department thinking? Shouldn't a young man like him, who had a mental problem, be trained more? In the end, Huai could only conclude there was something wrong with their heads. In any case, a salted fish like him was definitely not as responsible as AI Ching. Basically, he would touch if he could, drag if he could, push if he could, and play if he could. The Astronomical Society wasn't even afraid of him, so what was he worried about? He had full confidence in himself. He wasn't sure about other things, but he was too good at digging his own grave. Give me 2 months, and before the new year, I will be able to get rid of this position. By then, the sea will be wide, and the sky will be wide. Wouldn't that be perfect? Huai propped himself up and leaned against the headboard, finding a more comfortable position. Soon, he saw the small box between the fresh flowers on the bedside table. The packaging was familiar. He seemed to have seen it somewhere before. When he reached out and opened the box, he saw the bright crystal lying on the black velvet, a miracle condensed from faith and prayer. The light of divine grace. Below the crystal, there was a small note. Someone had left a message in beautiful handwriting. It seemed to be a farewell, but there was no name written on it. Huai was stunned. After a long time, he picked up the note in his hand and stared at the message. The sun will rise as usual? He was amused. No matter what happened, the sun would rise as usual, illuminating everything old or new, and then set as usual, throwing the good and the bad into the darkness. Even if some things seemed to be an earth-shattering upheaval or an incredible miracle, no matter who was born or who disappeared, or who came or who left, it would not stop. This world would be the same without anyone, and it was the same for everyone. No one was indispensable, just like no one was impossible to exist. There was no parting that was unacceptable. Can't you just say goodbye? Huai shook his head and sighed helplessly. Where did she learn this hardcore way of saying goodbye? Or was she really so strong that she threw the possibility of reuniting to the back of her mind and wanted to say goodbye to him forever? Let her be. Anyway, a scourge like her would cause trouble even if she was thrown to the border. He would think about it when the time came. Well, even if she came crying to him and asked his good brother Huai to help her, even if she was willing to do anything in return, Huai would never be soft-hearted. 30 years on the surface of the river, 30 years at the bottom of the river. Don't bully the young for being poor. Thinking of the scene of Ai Ching admitting defeat and begging him, Huai could not help but laugh loudly. After a long time in the slowly rising sleepiness, he fell into a deep sleep. Outside the window, the night passed little by little. After an unknown amount of time, the dim sky lit up again with the soft morning light. A new day was coming, as if the old day was about to end. The sun rose as usual. Chapter 313. Name? Huai. Age? 17. Gender? In the solemn and silent office, Huai slumped on the chair and couldn't help but sigh. Old Fu, what's the use of doing all these fancy things every time? But the man behind the desk slammed the table angrily. Who are you calling Old Fu? Huai smiled and proudly retreated. We're on the same level now, so I won't call you Old Fu. Do you think it's appropriate for me to call you Uncle Fu? You even want to take advantage of the Astronomy Society. You're too much. You still know that you're the supervisor of the Astronomy Society. Old Fu was even angrier. He took out a thick stack of documents from the cabinet and slapped it in front of Huai. We've already sorted out this month's monthly report, weekly report, and the following quarterly report. I've urged you 100,000 times, but you haven't written a single word. Hurry up and do your work. I'm stuck, can't I? Huai retorted righteously. Besides, isn't the deadline not yet? Even if it's the end of the month, as long as you don't arrive before 12 o'clock, it's not considered a delay. After a certain someone said that, he even put on an expression that said, "Why do we need to explain to others what the Astronomy Society does?" This made old Fu clench his teeth so hard that they almost broke. Ever since this little bastard became the supervisor, he was completely done for. He didn't do any proper work and started to slack off and be a salary thief. Forget about being a salary thief. He was paid by the Astronomy Society anyway. However, there were still a lot of action documents and scene maintenance work that required the supervisor's participation. This bastard had already slacked off from the Astronomy Society to the Social Security Bureau. This made Director Fu, who had never been one to let sand in his eyes, so angry that his teeth started to itch. He watched as the lively young man from back then became an old salted fish and a copper pea, but he couldn't do anything about it. Director Fu actually started to miss the time when AI Qing was still around. Although he wasn't easy to deal with, he never had any problems with his daily work. Now, the weekly report was not handed in until the last minute. The monthly report was not written until the 31st of the month. As for the quarterly report, what was a quarterly report? In the beginning, this guy was perfunctorily writing a few standard documents on his computer. Later on, he simply took 30 pieces of white paper with the Astronomical Society's seal and threw them to the Special Affairs Department at the end of the month. Not to mention the documents, even the printer had to use the Special Affairs Department's ink cartridges. If it was just this, it would have been fine. After all, many idle inspectors would use the Astronomical Society's permission to make money. They wanted to take advantage of the local economy. But when they met such a Buddhist person like Huaishur, according to the position of the Special Affairs Department, it was too late to cheer. But Director Fu couldn't stand it anymore. "It's fine if you don't go to work, but you go to school every day with a cowherd face and hang around my daughter. It makes me feel uneasy. Can't you just do your job properly?" "Who said I don't work?" Huaishur's expression suddenly became serious. He slammed the table and asked in a loud voice, "Do you know what day it is today?" Director Fu froze for a moment and was immediately at a loss. What day? He picked up the desk calendar and flipped it over for a long time. He didn't see any to-do items or any special holiday symbols. He became more and more confused. Today is the day of the college entrance examinations pledge ceremony. Huaishur picked up the teacup and took a sip slowly. He squinted at Director Fu and said helplessly, "I gave up such an important day to attend the pledge ceremony at school and came here to have a meeting with you. You're actually telling me this? Director Fu, do you really care about the future flower of the motherland?" Director Fu froze for a long time. His expression twitched and the veins on his forehead popped like two children jumping rope. Every time the veins popped, 4 legs would stomp on his head, his cranial pressure soared. "Flower? The motherland has 8 lifetimes of bad luck to have a flower like you in the future." He used the last of his rationality to convince himself that he couldn't kill this little bee asterisk starred in his own office. He could only pant and try his best to look away. Then, he saw Huaishur's phone vibrate violently. After 3 crisp sounds of the alarm, a red message popped up on the interface of the Astronomy Society's internal application, causing Director Fu to freeze on the spot. An orange alert from the Astronomy Society? That was a large-scale disaster warning second only to floods and hurricanes. Something big had happened. Huaishur looked down and reached out his hand expressionlessly to press the alert. He turned back to drink his tea and comforted Director Fu. "Don't worry, it's nothing. It's happened so many times in the past 2 days. These people are always making a fuss over nothing. Why don't you take a look at what's up there?" Director Fu's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Normally, if it was really related to Xian Hai, the Social Security Bureau's notice would have arrived a long time ago. Since he didn't receive it, it probably had nothing to do with Xian Hai or even the whole of Dong Xia. But this was the first time he had seen AB** starred press the alert from the headquarters with an expression that said, "It's none of my business." And based on what he said, it wasn't just once. With an inspector like this, would he really be able to survive until retirement? Director Fu once again started to doubt this from the bottom of his heart. By the way, why am I here? Huaisheng scratched his head for a long time. Finally, he slammed the table and remembered. Proof of entry and exit. Director Fu expressionlessly took out a box from the drawer and placed it in front of Huaisheng. Then, he pointed at the office door. You can leave. Okay, you're leaving. Old Fu, you're getting more and more impolite. You don't even let people drink more than a cup of tea. Huaisheng put down the teacup, picked up the things, and prepared to leave. Suddenly, he remembered something and turned back to ask, "Oh right, I haven't seen Fu Yi in a long time. Where did she go?" In the silence, Director Fu slowly picked up the phone in his hand and showed him the action team's phone number. "Believe it or not, as long as I call this number, you're dead meat." I believe it, okay?" Huaisheng curled his lips and sped up to leave. "Every time I come to this stupid place, I have to be interrogated. I don't even want to come." "Oh right," I stamped the seal on the A4 paper. "Send someone to my house in a few days to get it." After walking a distance, he turned back and pushed the door open. Before he finished speaking, he saw Director Fu pick up the thermos flask on the table and rush toward him. Director Fu hurriedly closed the door and ran away. This middle-aged man is already holding a thermos flask. Why is he still so hot-tempered? Isn't he afraid of a cerebral hemorrhage? Huaisheng shook his head as he walked out of the door of the Special Affairs Department. After throwing the box into his backpack, he took out his keys and realized that he had forgotten where his car was parked. Then, he heard the guard yelling, "Who is this? This is the third time this month. Why can't you park your broken bicycle inside? Why did you have to tie it to the door? It's one thing to tie it up, but you have to F***king tie it up. Last time, you even left a hole in Director Fu's car. You don't want this month's salary." Sorry, I'll drive away now." Huaisheng dejectedly picked up her bicycle, which was hanging on the iron gate, and ran away under the angry glare of the guard. Yeah, an old triangular steel frame bicycle. He just bought it at a discount. Not to mention, it was quite easy to ride and was very fast. The life of a rich person is really good. If I want to ride a bicycle, I'll ride a bicycle. If I want to take a bus, I'll take a bus. Huaisheng enjoyed the envious looks of the people on the street. He whistled and pedaled his bicycle to the Chalcedony building. If it wasn't too eye-catching, he would have called Brother Ma out to help him. That way, he wouldn't even have to pedal. After considering that if he said that, not only would the bicycle be destroyed, but his face would also have a few more horse hooves, he didn't dare to talk to White Horse. This horse was good at everything except for its bad temper and its appetite. Now, with Feng Shu taking care of it 3 times a day and eating all kinds of fruits, the horse was as fat as a balloon when it came back. Feng Shu's food was too good. It was like he was raising a pig. He had afternoon tea and supper 3 times a day, and he never stopped eating snack. Now that it was mealtime, it didn't need Huaisheng to call it. It would trot to the Chalcedony building to eat. Occasionally, when it was in a good mood, it would steal Huaisheng's pancakes to eat. Now, there was a white horse and a crow at home. It was like a zoo. Wait, a crow? He suddenly had an ominous premonition. Immediately after, he felt his phone vibrate violently in his trouser pocket. It was as if a group of people were dancing in circles in his pocket. It vibrated non-stop. It was another alarm. The people from the Astronomy Society were always making a fuss about nothing. They would give an early warning about border disturbances, a slightly high wave in the endless ocean, and a warning about people entering the Discovery realm. They just sent text messages all day long. They weren't afraid of disturbing the people. Huaisheng calmly took out her phone. Just as she was about to see what the group of idiots had sent her, she almost flew off her bicycle. Your bank card ending with 4444 has spent 170,000 yuan today. Your bank card ending with 4444 has spent 670,000 yuan today. Your bank card ending with 4444 has spent what the hell? A series of spending messages jumped out of the phone like a flood. When Huaishir saw it, it was still jumping. He was so scared that he almost fell into a ditch. My money! Huaishir's face turned green with fright. He pedaled the bicycle as if his butt was on fire. The friction between the chain and the gears almost burst out with sparks. He instantly accelerated. The old-fashioned bicycle screeched and sped past an off-road vehicle, then a sports car. He didn't even leave behind the exhaust. He disappeared from the driver's sight as if he had seen a ghost. By the time Huaishir rushed up the mountain, it was already too late. What was done couldn't be undone. Huge trucks with yesterday's delivery logo were parked outside the Stone Marrow Hall. The bounty that Huaishir obtained from killing so many wanted criminals was already attached to the crow's little wings. It fluttered and flew into the distance. Hello, this is a 3-phase reactor from Hermes' workshop. Please sign here. Hello, this is a heavy-duty water-free chemical extraction platform. Water refinement precision source balancing device. This is the main unit of the ultrafine optical engraving machine and 17 boxes of accessories. I am an engineer from the Border Power Grid Group. Thank you for the 10-year power supply service. Later, our construction team will connect you to the special equipment of the border power supply. One delivery person after another surrounded Huaishir in the middle and said the words that would take the money away. Then, with a smile, they handed the signed form to Huaishir and waited for his signature. They also straightforwardly expressed that they would not return the money once it was in the account. After Huaishir signed all the bills, he wanted to cry but had no tears. His whole body had turned gray and he almost couldn't breathe. Only the crow that landed on his shoulder raised its wings and patted his head. It comforted him with a voice that no one could hear. Don't be sad. Sometimes you have to think positively. She said softly, from another perspective, your money didn't leave you. Instead, it became the way I like to stay by your side. Thinking about it like this, don't you feel happy? Huaishir felt despair. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.